Chapter 1. Jody. Jody's first indication there was a problem came from the cackling laugh from Graham's room, followed by two of the movers beating a hasty retreat as her grandmother walked behind them at a more sedate pace. The two young men ran for the truck, and Jody couldn't help wondering if that meant they were finished working. She knew the truck was still half full, but her grandmother had obviously done something. Isabel turned to go back into the house before she could ask her. With a small sigh, she walked toward Isabel's room, knocking as she hovered near the door. She was surprised to find her 79-year-old grandmother kneeling on the floor. It was an even bigger surprise to find the older woman surrounded by adult toys expelled out of a box. Jody groaned as she stepped through the doorway. What happened? The young fellas weren't paying close enough attention. I told them to be careful, but I think one stumbled into the other when they saw the words written on the outside of the box. Her gaze moved that way automatically, picking up the words, adult toys, scrawled in big black Sharpie. She groaned. Graham, why couldn't you put something more innocuous on the outside? Why should I? I need to know what's in there so I can unpack efficiently. She waved in a careless fashion. Jody couldn't take her eyes off the purple toy her grandmother held. It was almost mesmerizing, yet simultaneously nauseating. Abruptly, she looked away and cleared her throat. Have you scarred the moving men for life? If I have, they can't be made of very stern stuff. Isabel seemed unconcerned about the idea. It's not my fault they have butterfingers and ended up prying in a lady's business, seeing what they weren't meant to see. Jody decided not to argue. While she firmly believed her grandmother could have picked a more innocent name for her box of toys, one that wouldn't have caused shock and accidental dropping on the part of the young man holding it, she couldn't deny Isabel had a point as well. They were her belongings labeled for her new home, and she had every right to expect a level of professionalism. Deciding it was prudent to ensure the movers were still working, rather than having scraped everything out of the back of the truck and left it on the lawn before driving away, she walked outside. 4 of the men were industriously moving items back and forth, but 2 hovered near the truck, with one leaning against the trunk of a tree. He looked a little nauseated, and Jody was certain he was the one who dropped the box of toys. No doubt, he was mentally torturing himself with the idea of Isabel entertaining herself. Jody chuckled at the thought, understanding why the young man had to be disturbed. He couldn't be much past 20 or so, and he would have been young enough to be her own kid, if she'd ever been inclined to have any. She turned away from the 2 movers who were occupied with their own drama and nearly ran into the owner of the company. She would have been surprised to see him doing the menial tasks of his company, but she had a feeling the man had tagged along as a way to get more acquainted with Jody's mom. As if on cue, Anson asked, "Where's your mother, Sheriff Shaw?" "The last I saw, she was in the kitchen." Thankfully, Willa had been spared the drama with the adult toys, or her poor mother probably would have had a heart attack. She was every inch the staid traditionalist, as though she'd rebelled against Isabel's free spirit and open way of raising her by becoming as conventional as possible. "Does your ma spend much time in the kitchen?" She shrugged. "She used to spend more time when my father was still alive. He had a sweet tooth, and she used to bake for him." She was certain that was the kind of thing this guy wanted to hear. He couldn't be much older than her. Mom's 62 years, and he was probably enchanted by that certain ageless quality her mother had. At 43, Jody already had more wrinkles than Willa, and she imagined it would always be that way. All 3 women shared the same bone structure, and they had sparkling blue eyes, but Willa had a timeless beauty that had skipped over both Isabel and Jody. Jody felt no envy for her mom though. Willa was decidedly feminine, soft, and delicate in a way that appealed to men. They often mistook her for fragile, and Jody found the idea of being thought of as fragile more annoying than appealing. It hovered on the tip of her tongue to warn Anson that her mother was still struggling with the loss of her husband, though it had been 2 years. Thinking of her strong and robust dad sent a pang through Jody's chest as well, reminding her she wasn't over the loss either. Elton Shaw had been a larger-than-life figure, and it was no wonder her mother wasn't ready to move on. She had no time for issuing warnings to a man who lived 2 hours away and was unlikely to be in their lives for long. As it was, she was going to be late thanks to having to check on the movers. If they had arrived on time, she would have already dealt with most of this before having to meet the mayor at the sheriff's office, but there was no point in scolding Anson for his people being late. It was only by a few hours, though she wondered how they could be as late as they were since it was only a 2-hour drive from Salem to Harrow Bay. Isabel and Willa were already aware she had to report to the sheriff's office long enough to meet with the mayor and be introduced to her deputies, so she didn't bother to part with them or remind them she was leaving. Wearing her uniform would have clued them in any way. Instead, she got into the SUV provided by the city for her use. It was suffocatingly hot in there, which could have been from the windows being up for a prolonged period, or it could have been an insidious hot flash creeping over her. Those were coming more frequently of late, and she dared hope it heralded the arrival of menopause, though getting there was a chore. Deciding it was the truck, not hormones, making her hot, since it had been parked in the driveway when they arrived last night, along with a note from the mayor instructing her to use it right away, she blasted the AC. As air circulated through the vents, she wrinkled her nose at the faint lingering odor she'd inherited from the previous sheriff, who'd owned the Blazer before her. It smelled like cheap spray tan and Cheetos. She hadn't met Dwight Haskins, but he'd appeared to be a competent sheriff from everything she'd heard from the mayor and city council people when she'd been interviewed. It had taken them 3 rounds to settle on her, and the due diligence of the small town had actually surprised her. It was true she had risen through the ranks to deputy sheriff naturally in Woodburn, proving herself over time, but she'd still been surprised by the vigorous background check, almost embarrassingly thorough questions, and the probing into every detail of her life. Still, it was the kind of opportunity she sought, moving away from the urban sprawl and returning to her grandmother's hometown, so she'd endure the process. It had paid off, and she'd received word 3 weeks ago they were hiring her. Now, it was a mere formality to join the mayor at the sheriff's office, get the keys to the station, meet her staff, and sign out a weapon, though she was tempted to keep the Smith & Wesson she'd had to purchase as part of her previous job. She'd grown comfortable with the weapon over the years and would now use it for home defense unless she decided against taking one of the available weapons from the station. She would have to see what their armory consisted of, but she doubted it could rival the one she'd left in Woodburn. This was Jody's 4th trip out of the town, and she slowed to admire Harrow Bay along the way, moving at a snail's pace down the main street, which was so originally named Main Street, as she eyed Avis's Diner, Manwaring's Auto Repair, and Patty's Craft Palace, among others. There seemed to be a trend of including the owner's name, and it matched the quaintness of the town well. It was probably a marketing gimmick, but there was an overall old-world European feel to the designs, at least on Main Street. Each business had wooden signs hand-burned with names of the businesses hanging from wrought iron posts. It was all charming, and it was part of the reason Jody had wanted the job so badly. The sheriff's station was located right at the end of Main Street, and she parked the SUV in a parking space labeled, "Reserved for Sheriff." There were 2 other spots beside it labeled, "Reserved for Deputy," and both were filled with squad cars. There was also a shiny red convertible, and she imagined it belonged to Adam Carroll. The mayor had to be in his late 40s, an age ripe for a midlife crisis, and he seemed like the kind to drive just such a car. Taking a deep breath, Jody exited the SUV and walked into the sheriff's station. She had been here for her last interview, meeting just with the mayor himself, and it was still an odd conglomeration of mismatched decor, complete with rough timber walls, a deer head mounted above the entryway, and the wall of wanted posters displayed in such a way that suggested someone almost considered them art. She walked forward, catching the gaze of the petite redhead manning the desk. She hadn't met her yet, but she assumed it must be Tara Jenkins, according to the packet of information she'd received. Tara? The redhead nodded and beamed. She held out her hand as she scurried out from behind the desk. "You must be Sheriff Shaw. It's a real pleasure to meet you, Sheriff." She lowered her voice in a conspiratorial fashion. You are the first female sheriff we've ever had. I'd say it's about time. Jody grinned at her as she nodded her agreement, though she didn't verbally acknowledge the words. She hadn't spent much time in Harrow Bay, but she got the sense it was a more conservative town. It was certainly going to be quite different from Woodburn, which had become part of Salem de facto through the spread of people moving outward. Jody liked the unique energy about Salem, and even more so in Portland, but she was still grateful to be escaping. She wanted something different, and Harrow Bay seemed to offer that. Tara led her forward, and Jody could hear Adam Carroll's voice carrying even before they passed the entryway and walked down the hallway. He was gathered in what would be Jody's office, along with two people whose backs were turned toward her. He caught sight of her, and his grin grew as he rushed forward, taking her other hand and making Jody aware Tara was still leading her by the arm. She gently disengaged from both of them after a quick handshake with the mayor. He put his hand on her lower back and drew her forward. Jody didn't like the overly familiar touch, but she wasn't going to pitch a fuss. Adam Carroll seemed like a ladies' man, and perhaps she could see why. He was a little soft around the middle, but he had smooth and handsome features with distinctive crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and an attractive furrow in his brow. His mostly dark hair had strands of silver throughout, and he had compelling dark eyes. There was certainly nothing wrong with his appearance, and he had a suave, smooth air about him, but Jody wasn't in the market for a relationship, particularly not with someone who could technically be considered her boss. With that in mind, she eased away from him as soon as it was politely possible when the people in the chairs turned to look at her. Her gaze met the woman's first, and she smiled. Jody, allow me to introduce Aoife Saros, your senior deputy. She's been with the force almost 10 years now. Jody reached out and shook the hand offered to her by the pretty black woman. Aoife had myriad tiny braids, and they had been confined into a tidy bun at the back of her head. Her warm smile appeared genuine, and it reached her eyes, which were a deep brown shade. They were framed by purple glasses that added a startling contrast, but they flattered her well. It's nice to meet you, Aoife. You as well, Sheriff Shaw. Jody thought about asking her to use her first name, but she held back. It was better to get the lay of the land first before she decided to be too informal. She turned her attention to the young man seated beside Aoife, waiting until Adam Carroll said, "This is Michael Cross. He joined the department 2 years ago." Jody took his hand, eyeing the young man. He had a neat appearance, a thin face, a well-kept beard that reminded her of some of the finest ones she'd seen in Portland, and his hair in a man bun. Despite his hipster look, she got a wild vibe from him she couldn't explain. He seemed like he was on edge, though he sat quietly and with perfect stillness. His silver eyes, rimmed with a bright blue, weren't exactly unnerving, but they made her aware he was watching her every move. She wouldn't call it nervousness, but she was certainly on alert around him. After a long moment, the mayor cleared his throat. "If you'll excuse us, I have business to discuss with the new sheriff." He shot them all a look, and there was definitely some kind of meaning behind it. Jody was surprised at how quickly the office cleared, and she stood in front of the mayor, wondering what was so important that he had to shoo out the others. As far as she knew, this was simply an administrative meeting to make sure she was settled in, met her staff, and was ready to go when she officially started her duties as the sheriff the next day. "Have a seat, Jody." It set her teeth on edge that he so familiarly called her by her first name, but she didn't want to get off to a rocky start with the mayor, so she walked over and took a seat behind her desk. His eyes widened slightly, and it was clear he'd expected her to take one of the seats the deputies had abandoned. Jody thought it was prudent to stake her claim and remind him of her position right from the start. He came over to stand beside her, hovering a little closer than she would like. She scooched her chair back an inch or two, not wanting to concede any territory, but appreciating some personal space. "I've been all over the information you forwarded me after our last meeting, Mr. Carroll." He chuckled. "Adam, remember? There's no need to be so formal." She nodded, but she didn't repeat his name. "I feel confident I'm ready to begin my duties tomorrow, sir." He smiled. That's excellent, but there is one piece missing. Jody shook her head. I don't know what you mean. The packet seemed to have everything. Some things can't be written down, Jody, and they can't be shared unless you're here. He lifted his hand, bringing it close to her face. When she jerked away, thinking he was going to stroke her hair, he asked, May I? Jody eyed him warily as she nodded once, hoping she wasn't about to be hit on by the mayor. Even though he was attractive, he wasn't really her type, and she wasn't going to risk her new job. His fingers were light as they brushed against her forehead. At first, she barely felt a thing, and she wondered what he was doing. Suddenly, there was a jolt that shot through her body, and it felt like an electrical shock. As it did so, memories that definitely weren't her own started to unfold in her mind. She could see murky people in the past running through shadows and fleeing unseen dangers. She saw the same people coming together to construct Harrow Bay, and she felt that same electric jolt suffuse her body. She gasped as she collapsed backward against her chair, staring up at him without speaking. Harrow Bay isn't quite what you expected, said the mayor with a certain hint of satisfaction. Folks here are different. Jody slowly regained the ability to speak. That wasn't part of the advertisement for the position, and you sure didn't explain the differences included magical folks and creatures of the night. She could scarcely believe what he'd shown her, but the knowledge now resided within her, along with a faint hum she couldn't explain. It was like she was dialed into the town's energy now, and it had become part of her. Why didn't my Gram ever say anything? The mayor shrugged. I doubt she remembered, for that's part of the magic of the town. If you move away, you gradually forget about its existence. Oh, I guess I shouldn't say that. You still remember that you lived here, but you forget about the magical properties. You're no longer truly part of the fiber of the town, and you're not contributing to the communal magic that allows our little hamlet to function. When your grandmother left, she would have soon forgotten all about everything that makes Harrow Bay special or unique. Of course, it should come back to her now that she's returned. Jody clenched her hands on her lap, feeling overwhelmed. What am I supposed to do here? He frowned. You do the same thing you would anywhere: keep the peace, protect people, and handle the bad guys. Sometimes, the bad guys have magic, fur, or fangs. He chuckled, clearly amused by that. Jody was having trouble finding similar amusement. I have a feeling my Smith & Wesson isn't going to be much help against people like that, so how am I supposed to make sure they follow the rules if they don't feel like doing it? He smiled. The magic's in you now, Jody. He stood up from where he'd been leaning against her desk. That reminds me. He trailed off as he walked to the bookshelf behind her, turning where she couldn't see him for a minute. When he turned back to her, he held an old, thick book in his hands. You're going to need this. You have the magic, but you still have to learn how to use it. If you have any problem at all with that, I'll refer you to Amara at the library. As he spoke, he put the book in front of her. Jody lifted it slightly, curious about the heft. It was certainly heavy, and when she skimmed a finger down the spine, it caused a shiver to go through her. It felt old and powerful, and she was disturbed that she could sense such things now. She looked up at the mayor. So, if I decide this isn't for me, I'd move away from Harrow Bay and forget all about the magical aspects in time? He nodded. If you ever returned, you'd remember them after staying more than a short time, but I don't think you're going to leave. You seem like you're made of strong stuff, Jody, and that's just what we need. I know our questions were tough on you, and we really dug into your background, but that was because we wanted to prepare for every contingency. We know this is a lot to take on, but we think you're up to the responsibility of the task. He patted her lightly on the shoulder as he took a step back. I'll leave you to study and settle in. If you have any questions, you can call my secretary. Sasha will put you through if I'm at all available. Otherwise, you can always contact any of the city council people. He waved to an old-fashioned Rolodex on her desk. They're all in there. Jody felt like she had a million questions, but it was obvious the mayor was done with his introductions, so she managed a verbal parting before he left, and she opened the book slowly. She earnestly tried to read it, and while it all made sense in an abstract way, she wasn't certain how to put it all together. There were steps for creating spells, instructions on how to channel her magic, and other tidbits that she imagined to be of use if she decided to stay in her position and train to reach her full potential. At the moment, she wasn't certain she was up for that as she stood up. She needed to escape, though she did take the book with her. She was almost surprised when neither of the deputies nor the receptionist tried to stop her as she left in a hurry, but they probably knew everything she had just learned, and they likely realized she required time to absorb it before she could make a long-term decision. Besides, she needed to discuss this with Willa and Isabel as well. She wasn't the only one affected by living in a magical town. Chapter 2. Jody re-entered her new house a few minutes later, calling for her mother and grandmother. The movers were gone, and it was starting to take on the look of a home. Now that Jody knew the truth about Harrow Bay, she wasn't certain she could view it that way. Could she even stay here? Willa called an answer from the kitchen, so Jody made her way there. Her grandmother entered seconds after she did, and they were greeted by Willa brewing a pot of tea. She collapsed into a chair at the table. Isabel frowned at her. "What's the matter, Jody? I didn't expect you to be home so soon. Or looking so pale," said Willa with a hint of concern as she turned to them to place the clear teapot in the center of the table. The flowering tea bag she'd picked was blooming to life, but Jody couldn't really appreciate it now. She blinked and looked at her grandmother and mother before standing up. Most of the boxes remained packed, but she sorted through them until she found the one marked liquor and pulled off the lid. When she returned to the table, she put down the whiskey beside her teacup, ignoring her mom's frown of disapproval. "I'm not even sure how to tell you this." She slanted a glance at Isabel as her mother sat down at the table to join them. "You should remember it, I guess." "Remember what, dear?" asked Isabel as she added a liberal amount of honey to her tea. "Take it easy on the sweetener, Mom," said Willa with a frown. "It's raw honey and good for my allergies." As though in defiance of her daughter's admonishment, Isabel added another half-turn from the honey spoon before returning the dispenser to the jar. "Harrow Bay isn't what we thought it was." Jody was trying to think of an easier way to break the news to them, but how could she? If Adam hadn't shown her the truth, she never would have believed it herself. Just thinking about it had her skipping the tea and pouring whiskey directly into her empty teacup. "What are you doing, Jody? It's not even 5 o'clock yet." Willa clicked her tongue, looking like she was going to reach for the whiskey bottle to remove it from her daughter's reach. Jody shot her a look, keeping her hand clamped around the glass for a minute. "Just wait. You might want some too." Willa sniffed. "I would hardly think so." Jody took several sips of the whiskey, waiting until she could feel the burning warmth spread through her before she broached the subject again. "The mayor showed me the truth." Willa frowned. "What truth, dear?" "This town is magical." Willa smiled. "It does seem rather magical, does it not?" She let out a wistful sigh. "It's positively idyllic." "No, I mean real magic. As in the kind of magic that does things to people. There are creatures living here that aren't supposed to exist, and there's a hellgate at the center of town." Jody probably should have been gentler with sharing that, but she couldn't think of a way to phrase it that her mom would believe anyway. Willa looked shocked, and Isabel was surprised for a moment, but then her expression began to soften, and she smiled slowly. "I'd forgotten all about that. How could something like that slip my mind? The mayor explained it to me that if you leave Harrow Bay for very long, you forget all about the magical properties of the town." Isabel still seemed surprised. She shook her head. "How could I forget my first kiss? It was out at the lake, with one of the merfolk." Willa let out a gasping sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Mother," she snapped before glaring at Jody. "I don't know why you think this is funny, but my nerves are frazzled enough from the move, Jody. I might have anticipated something like this from you when you were still in high school, but as an adult woman." She shook her head as she clicked her tongue again. "I expect far more maturity from you." In spite of herself, Jody managed a small smile as she realized Willa hadn't chastised Isabel for what she believed to be a prank. No doubt, she would have expected such a thing from her own mother if not her daughter. The topic of conversation was too serious to let her mother not to accept the veracity though. I wish I were kidding, but it's the truth, Mom. Willa frowned. I don't believe it. I wish I could give you the crash course like the mayor gave me. Wondering if she had that ability now that she could tap into the town's magic, Jody reached out her hand and brushed against her mom's forehead. She tried to remember everything that had flashed through her head, but her mother just swatted her hand away impatiently. I'm not feverish. Jody sighed, accepting either she lacked that ability, or she hadn't learned how to use it yet. The made her groan softly as she remembered the book waiting for her to study, and she leaned back slightly to rub the bridge of her nose. Look, Mom, I'm not kidding with you. Harrow Bay is all the things I've said and probably more. There's a genuine conduit to hell waiting at the center of town due to a convergence of the ley lines. Her mother shook her head. It wasn't even funny to start with, but it grows less funny by the moment. Jody's telling you the truth. It's all coming back to me now, said Isabel, who reached for the whiskey bottle. She ignored Willa's admonishment and added a healthy dash to her cup of tea. You'd best accept it and move on, Willa. I won't accept such foolishness. I don't know when you two decided to cook up this evil scheme, and what you hope to gain from it besides making me look ridiculous, but I assure you it won't work. Willa gave them both a prim incline of her head followed by a withering glare. Knowing there was only one way her mother was going to believe it, Jody focused on the jar of honey still in front of her grandmother. She had no idea what she was doing, but she hoped it would be an innate sort of function, and she concentrated on making the jar move a few inches. It wiggled for a moment and scooted about 1/4 of an inch before stopping. She looked up, disappointed to see Willa had been staring down into her cup. With a sigh and a deep breath, Jody focused again, visualizing the jar sliding across the table. 1 second, it wasn't moving at all. Then there was the faintest hint of vibration, and abruptly, it lifted off the table, flew through the air, and crashed against the wall. The golden honey dripped down the white paint as Willa started in shock. Her mother's eyes darted around the room, clearly looking for an explanation, but Jody wasn't sure she'd find one even though she seemed convinced they were just teasing her. What just happened? Willa sounded oddly calm. I did that, said Jody. Willa frowned. You did not. You can't even reach the honey from where you sit. Jody tapped her forehead. I did it with my mind. Apparently, accessing the town's magic is part and parcel of the job. I'll need to study and learn more, but I can do magic now. That sounded utterly insane to say aloud, but she couldn't deny it was the truth. Jody waited to see if her mother would somehow find a way to reject it though. It was obvious Willa was scrambling mentally for an explanation. A variety of conflicting emotions crossed her face, from rejection to anger to fear, followed by a calm resignation. I figured there was something too good to be true about this whole thing. She sighed. They hired you to be the sheriff when you've only ever been a deputy sheriff before, and you're a woman. Jody's teeth set on edge, and she resisted the urge to remind her mom that her gender had nothing to do with her competency. Recalling Willa was old-fashioned did little to soothe her annoyance, but it wasn't the topic to focus on right now. So, the town is a little different than we expected. It can still be a good thing. She wasn't certain who she was trying to convince with her optimistic tone. Part of Jody was still excited about the new job and the amazing opportunity, but another part of her wanted to pack up and leave, hopefully to forget all about the secrets of this town as quickly as possible. It sounds dangerous here. Willa reached for the whiskey bottle then, opening and sloshing some into her teacup in a haphazard fashion. It would be crazy to stay. I grew up here, and nothing bad ever happened to me, except Andy. Isabel grimaced. What I wouldn't give to do that over. Willa appeared wounded as she looked at her mother. If you did that over, you wouldn't have me, Mother. Is that what you want? Isabel frowned. Of course not. I just wouldn't have married him, that's all. If I could take it back, I'd still relive the 14 seconds in the back of his Chevy that led to you, but I sure wouldn't make the mistake of leaving my home and marrying him. Willa shuddered at the news her mother had just delivered while Jody struggled not to laugh, burying her face into her teacup. Truly, she wasn't amused to hear anything about her grandmother's personal life, because it was simply disturbing. However, her mother's reaction was pure entertainment, and that was likely why Isabel continued to say such shocking things. I just think we should leave. Willa sipped her tea as though it didn't have a slug of whiskey in it, but she coughed lightly. Let's just return to the Salem area. I don't have a job there anymore, said Jody. She shared her mom's doubts, but that was the brutal reality. She'd given up her position, and someone else would have stepped into it by now. If she did return, she would be relegated to deputy sheriff again, if she were lucky. More likely, she would end up as a regular deputy if there was an opening, or she would have to look in an entirely different jurisdiction for a position. She was unlikely to find a sheriff's spot waiting for her elsewhere, particularly since it was often an elected position. She didn't like the idea of running away either. Jody's parents had raised her to see through challenges, and to finish what she started. Willa seemed to have temporarily forgotten that, but Jody hadn't. She softened her tone slightly, but she tried to stand firm when she said, "We need to give this a fair try." Willa protested for another few minutes, but she inevitably seemed to accept that Jody was determined to try, and Isabel had no desire to leave. That left her with the decision of either going alone or staying and trying to make it work in Harrow Bay. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she gulped the rest of her tea and whiskey combo before setting down the cup harder than necessary. "I guess I don't stand a chance against you two stubborn goats. I've been telling you that for years," said Isabel serenely before she chuckled. "Life would be easier if you listened to your mother, Willa." Willa snorted, a decidedly unladylike sound from her, and she subsided into silence. It spread around the room like a contagion, and the three of them quietly contemplated the future before them. Jody wondered if she was making the right decision, but when the only other option was to leave without even trying, what else could she do? Chapter 3. Willa. Willa spent most of the first week in Harrow Bay confined to the house. She still struggled sometimes with believing what Jody had told her, but she believed enough that she was afraid to venture out. Her mother had already started to reintegrate into the town, and Jody was settling in as well. For her part, Willa would be happy to return to Woodburn, or even Portland, though she didn't like some of the crazy ideas filtering out of there these days. And what were the young men thinking, traipsing around in kilts with long hair they wore a bun? It was disgraceful, but it seemed like a mild inconvenience compared to the idea of sharing a town with magical creatures. As the groceries dwindled, Willa realized she would have to venture forth soon or ask Jody to shop for her. She didn't want to add to her daughter's burdens, and she certainly wasn't going to trust Isabel to pick up anything healthy. Her mother had a terrible sweet tooth, a craving for spicy foods, and far too much fondness for wine to be trusted to bring home a proper diet. Willa couldn't deny she was getting a little stir-crazy anyway, for she had been trapped in the house so long that she had counted the number of tiles in the shower, along with the water stains in the rooms on the upper floor that indicated at one point, the roof had given way before being repaired. She'd walked the halls and unpacked, arranging everything at least half a dozen times in her quest to stay busy, but it was slowly driving her mad. That morning, she set out to conquer her fear, or at least try to adapt slightly to the new circumstances. Willa decided the best way to handle it was to pretend like magic didn't exist. If she ignored it, it would surely leave her alone, and she'd never have to confront it for herself. It struck her as an eminently sensible approach if she were to be stuck here with her daughter and her mother, and so she dressed in a cheerful outfit, dug out the keys for the Toyota from the purse that had remained hanging on the hook since the day they'd moved in, and departed the house after double-checking that her mother wasn't inside. Had she been, she would have asked Isabel to come with her, but her mother was already out doing whatever it was she did these days to occupy herself. Willa drove slowly from their street before merging onto Main Street. The whole town was charming, and she'd noticed it when they first moved in. She spent some time appraising it all now, doing her best to see only the surface. If there was a seething underbelly of paranormal darkness, she didn't want to know about it. Even as she tried to remain oblivious, Willa couldn't ignore the shudder that went through her and the chill that shot up her spine as she passed the park located directly in the center of town. She didn't fail to notice there were no children playing on the playground equipment, and no one seemed to be using the space. She wondered who'd thought it was a good idea to put a park there if what Jody claimed was there was truly there. She couldn't imagine anyone wanting to spend time swinging with a hell gate beneath their feet or take their children to play on the grass. She forced her thoughts away from such matters, knowing she would go mad if she tried to contemplate them for too long. Instead, she saw a parking lot ahead, and she decided it was a good place to leave the car. She could explore some of Main Street on foot, and she could see Carol's grocery about half a block ahead. It took more courage than she expected to step out of the car after turning off the engine and stowing the keys in her purse. With a deep breath, summoning the sound of Elton's voice in the back of her mind as he urged her to get on with business, she managed to force herself from the car and closed the door behind her. She engaged the alarm as she began to walk down the street, her goal car. Oll's grocery. As she was walking, a brisk breeze started to blow, and she could smell the salt in the air and hear the roaring of the ocean, though they were a few blocks away. The sun emerged from the cloud cover and glinted off a set of silver bangles ahead of her, worn by a woman about her age. The light caught her attention, and she looked at her for a moment as she moved closer, seeing her arranging a bin of yarn that appeared to be on sale. A glance at the doorway revealed the place was Patty's Craft Palace, and Willa assumed the woman was Patty. She wasn't much of a crafter, but she'd always had an interest in learning. A sign caught her eye, and Willa moved closer to it, finding she was examining a list of classes that were forthcoming. "You must be the new sheriff's mother," said a dulcet voice behind her. She jumped, not expecting anyone to approach her, but turned with what she hoped was a friendly smile to find the woman who'd been organizing the bin of yarn. "Yes, I'm Willa Shaw." The other woman held out her hand, and Willa couldn't help noticing the calluses on her fingertips. She assumed they came from some of her crafting as the woman said, "I'm Patty Barrington. Welcome to Harrow Bay." "Thank you." She released her hand and took a step back, eyeing the sign again. "You teach crafting classes?" Patty nodded. "Either me or my daughter." "Are you a crafter?" Willa chuckled awkwardly. "I've always had more interest than talent." Patty shook her head. "That simply won't do. I like to believe there's nothing I can't teach anyone. What would you like to learn first?" Crochet?" Willa asked more than stated. Patty nodded for a moment as she looked at the schedule. "There's a class coming up in a couple of weeks, but there's no reason to wait that long. Come inside." Willa could have protested, reminding herself her true errand was to go to the grocery store, but she knew there was no harm in wasting a little time. Besides, it would be nice not to be cooped up in the house for a while, and she could certainly use the chance to make some new friends. That was one thing she was missing greatly about her life in Woodburn. She followed Patty into the store, and the other woman led her to a row that seemed to be nothing but crochet hooks and yarn, along with other apparatuses for which Willa had no name. Soon enough, Patty was unwrapping a crochet hook and selected a medium-weight gray yarn that she handed to Willa. "These should be good to start with." She gestured for Willa to follow her, leading her up to the register. Patty disappeared behind it, lifting out a basket a moment later displaying several crochet projects that appeared to be in progress. Patty shook her head. "I'm afraid I have trouble staying focused on one task. It's quite shameful in my business." She grinned as she said that. She spent the next few minutes instructing Willa how to tie her yarn and begin a chain stitch, and Willa did her best to move awkwardly through the steps. As she tried to focus, she realized there was silence between them, and that wouldn't be conducive for forming a friendship. "You mentioned your daughter?" Patty nodded. "I have 3 of them, and Liesl still lives at home. I think she thinks I need to be taken care of, or at least that's what she said when she came back from the city a few years ago." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Truthfully, I think she just got burned out living in Seattle and wanted to come home. I was happy to have her come back, and she's just as crafty as I am. Better yet, my daughter is good at sticking with things and completing her projects. My daughter can be dreadfully stubborn. As soon as we learned all about Harrow Bay, I was ready to leave, but Jody wants to stay and see how it goes." Willa realized she was treading perilously close to admitting the truth about the town, and that was a reality she wanted to avoid at all costs, so she quickly changed the subject. "What of your other 2 daughters?" "One lives in Phoenix, and she's married to a dreadful bore, but at least she has 2 wonderful children." I get to see my grandchildren quite often, especially since they're both in college now and away from the dreaded son-in-law. They no longer have to travel with him, so they can see me more freely. Willa let out a wistful sigh. It must be wonderful to have grandchildren. Patty's softly lined face reconfigured into an arrangement of happy wrinkles as she beamed. It's quite magical. I was rather surprised to hear the sheriff doesn't have any children. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. It must be quite dreadful for her, not being able to have them. Willa snorted before she could think better of it. It's not that. Jody just never had much interest in the traditional things, like having a family or getting married. She's always been much more interested in her career. She sighed heavily. That means no grandchildren. Is she your only child? Asked Patty. Willa shook her head. No, there's Ronnie. He lives in Vegas, but he's going through his third divorce. She sighed again. I hate to say it, but I'm almost relieved he has no children. I'd be afraid he'd leave them just as easily as he does his wives. It must be difficult not to be a grandmother, but our children have to be free to live their own lives. Patty seemed firmly convinced of that. Willa wasn't quite as assured. She still viewed it as her job to watch out for Jody, even if Jody was 43. Did that mean she sometimes gave unsolicited advice? Yes, but it came from experience, along with concern. Jody should be grateful for her counsel, but she sometimes seemed irritated with it instead. My third daughter is currently in Uganda. Willa blinked. What in the world is she doing there? She's with Doctors Without Borders, but she's currently trying to bring in healthcare to a tribe of cheetah shifters. Willa shuddered at hearing that, not wanting to think about magic at all. She certainly didn't want to imagine it could occur anywhere outside of Harrow Bay. Am I getting the hang of this? She held up her lopsided square. It was clear Patty wanted to laugh for a moment, but she must have a well of professionalism to call upon, because all she did was give a small smile. I think you might have missed a turn. Let's unwrap and start again. Willa followed her lead, and before she knew it, she'd spent almost 2 hours in conversation and crocheting with Patty. When she left the craft store sometime later, heading toward Carol's grocery, she was feeling more optimistic about starting over in Harrow Bay. If she could just avoid the less savory side of the town, and confine herself to the mundane world, she could be happy here. Patty already seemed like she might be a good friend. There was an air of camaraderie between them, like they'd known each other for years. As long as Willa remained willfully oblivious to the other parts of the town, Harrow Bay didn't seem so bad after all. Chapter 4. Jody had expected Harrow Bay to be exciting and full of danger, but she was beginning to think it was like any other small, sleepy town. That was mostly a relief, because she'd been looking for a slower pace of life, but she supposed there was a bit of disappointment or perhaps just general letdown at realizing the town wasn't the hotbed of crazy she thought it might be after learning its secrets. As always, Jody was still an early riser, so she was often the first one to the police station. It was no exception that morning when she arrived, stowing her lunch in the small fridge in the break room before turning on the coffee pot. After she had a strongly brewed cup of the magical elixir that kept her day flowing, she entered her office and started by reading through the night dispatcher's reports. There had been nothing major to report, and she wondered if there was any real point in having Oliver Kent on the night shift. With their small population and seeming solitude, along with a well-behaved populace, was it even necessary to have someone in the sheriff's station overnight? Fortunately, budgeting wasn't her problem, so if the city ordained the role necessary, she was happy to defer to them. After reviewing Oliver's few notes, she turned her attention to the file that had come in from the coroner sometime overnight. It was an update of last week's deaths, and 2/3 of them were accidental or old age. Considering there had been only 3 overall, she judged that reasonable. The third victim had been a suicide following something murkily labeled as involuntary transformation, so she supposed that could kind of fall under the natural causes category, at least for this town. With a sigh, Jody leaned back in her chair and propped her feet on the desk as she reached for the black coffee. She hated to admit it, but she was bored. She'd wanted something different from the constant rushing pace of serving the city from where she'd come, but she hadn't expected a standstill either. A clattering sound had her stiffening and glancing at the clock, revealing it was just a little past 7. It was unlikely to be Aoife, because she came in after taking her children to school, and Michael was often a few minutes late. Jody figured she should talk to him about that sometime, but since there wasn't much for them to do, it hadn't seemed like a priority. Not expecting it to be one of them, and hearing cursing in an unfamiliar voice, she stood up, barely remembering to slide back her chair before she fell on her butt. After regaining her composure and her dignity, she put her coffee cup on the desk and rested her hand on the Smith & Wesson she still used as her primary sidearm, since she'd yet to really investigate the armory. She couldn't imagine anyone up to mischief at the sheriff's station, but it was possible. Oliver went home at 6 a.m. and there was a period of time for about an hour where no one was at the station, though calls were routed to Tara's take-home cell in the interim. Her adrenaline was flowing, and her heart was pumping. Jody was a little tense, but she was also excited to have something to do again, and to have a hint of danger surrounding her. She was by no means an adrenaline junkie, but she didn't want to become bored and complacent as a cop either. She heard more cursing and realized it was coming from the supply room. She hastened in that direction, pausing outside the door for a moment to listen. She could identify only one voice, and she drew her gun before entering, moving quickly and staying low as she stepped inside and shouted, "Freeze! Police!" There was another clattering, followed by more cursing, but Jody didn't see anyone. She frowned as she looked around, knowing she didn't have the space to herself, but confused because she couldn't see anyone. Were there any invisible residents in town? Could it be a ghost? She felt preposterous considering the ideas, though she understood her worldview had shifted significantly in a short amount of time in the last week. "Hello?" she asked cautiously. "Thanks a lot. You ruined my shot." The crabby voice was coming from lower down, so as Jody eased forward, she looked around the room, keeping her gaze lowered. She gasped and let out a squeak of shock when she saw a red thing standing in the middle of the floor, holding a phone on a selfie stick. She started to sweat, and her stomach clenched with nausea as she eyed it. It looked like a demon. She had no idea what they looked like, but it seemed to have the defining characteristics: horns, cloven feet, a pointy tail, and bright red skin, along with glowing red eyes in a porcine face. It would have been downright intimidating, perhaps even terrifying, if it hadn't been a scant 2 feet tall. At 5'9", Jody towered over it, and she kept her gun focused on it as she got closer. "What are you?" He was scowling at her, not seeming to be bothered by either her presence or her gun. The lighting was perfect. "I waited 10 minutes for the sun to hit just the right point and shine through the windows. It's the most flattering light." With a sound of disgust, he shook his head as he started shuffling around the room. "I said freeze." Jody wished she could cock her gun again to make it sound more intimidating, but her voice would have to do. "Identify yourself and your purpose here." She finally seemed to have the red creature's attention, and it looked up at her. "I'm Bees, and I live here." She frowned. "You mean Harrow Bay?" He rolled his eyes, looking at her like she was slow. "I mean the sheriff's station, Sheriff Shaw." She stiffened. "You know who I am?" Though the little red demon nodded, he didn't look at her again. He was still fussing with his camera and muttering to himself. "If you live here, how come I don't know about it?" He shrugged a shoulder. "I figured it would be best to stay out of your way until you get a chance to settle in. I always make myself known to the new sheriffs, but it didn't feel like the right time yet." Jody was irritated, so she stepped forward and took the phone from him, including the selfie stick. She laid it down on the desk nearby, ignoring his grumble of protest that he couldn't reach it. "Tell me who you are and why you're here." "I'm Bees." He spoke slowly, as though he suspected she was a moron. "I live here." Jody huffed a sigh. "I understand what you've already told me, but it doesn't explain anything. For example, what the hell are you?" "I'm a demon." Jody wasn't entirely surprised to hear confirmation, But she still couldn't reconcile this tiny little package with the imagery of demons that permeated their culture. Shouldn't you be bigger? He glared up at her. We don't all come in the same sizes, just like humans, Sheriff. She supposed that was a fair point. If you're a demon, shouldn't you be in hell? He looked cagey for a moment, glancing away from her as he shifted on his hooves. Well, I guess, and I was at one point in time. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking embarrassed. Why aren't you there now? More importantly, why was he in her police station, and what was he doing with the phone on a selfie stick? I did something to piss off Luke a few millennia ago. He sounded blasé and shrugged. He still hasn't quite forgiven me, so it's safer if I just stay on Earth. I like Harrow Bay, so I settled here. Millennia? Jody shook her head. Just how old you? Bees seemed to be thinking about it for a moment, his brow furrowing. I think I'm somewhere between 7 and 8,000. It's kinda hard to keep track after a while, you know. Jody most emphatically didn't know, and she couldn't personally imagine time passing on such a scale. She cleared her throat, realizing she was still holding the Smith & Wesson trained on the red creature. He seemed relatively harmless, so she disengaged the trigger and pressed the safety, but she kept the gun at her side in case things went south. So, you live in Harrow Bay, but why are you at the sheriff's station? I live here. None of the other sheriffs minded. He grinned at her, though that was more of a grimace with the way his face was shaped, and it sent a chill through her. They think I'm charming after they get to know me. Jody shuddered at the idea, unable to imagine reaching such a conclusion, or to endure having him there. There's a new sheriff in town. He looked at her with a hint of disdain. What is this, a spaghetti western? Jody rolled her eyes. I simply mean, you and I don't have any such understanding. You don't live at the sheriff's station. I sure do. He gestured vaguely to the corner. Jody's gaze followed the path of his hand, seeing a camping cot, sleeping bag, and a few sundries arranged around it. She'd never noticed it before, but she had only been in the supply room once or twice during the week she'd been sheriff. Shouldn't you be in your own place instead of living here? I assume you don't pay rent? His chest puffed up. I'm not a charity case, Sheriff. I have magic, and I help out sometimes. Her head was pounding, and Jody pulled out a chair nearby to sit down in it. In that case, make yourself useful and get me a cappuccino. He glared at her. I'm not your gopher or your gal Friday. I help when I choose to help. Aren't you just super useful then? She shook her head. What's with the pictures? It's a hobby of mine. I like to document my life. I have. The sound of Aoife calling out a greeting interrupted him, and he looked disgruntled. Don't you have work to do, Sheriff Shaw? This conversation isn't over. Jody made sure there was warning in her tone as she stood up, pushing the wheeled chair back where it belonged, and left the supply room to find Aoife. The senior deputy was at her desk, unloading things from her bag. Jody couldn't help it as she reached out and lifted a brown paper bag covered with unicorn stickers and sparkles. You know how to go all out, Aoife. Her darker complexion hid a blush if it existed, but she seemed vaguely embarrassed. Jason made my lunch for me, and he likes to decorate. She eyed the bag, noticing the colors blended well, and the unicorn had good definition. It seems like he has talent. Aoife nodded, her proud smile saying enough that she didn't have to verbally brag on him. Then her expression changed, growing slightly troubled. So does Tyla, but getting that girl to focus on anything besides boys and defiance. She trailed off as she shook her head. She's just so damned unreasonable, and she reminds me way too much of someone. Her father? Asked Jody, hazarding a guess. Aoife snorted. Not hardly. He wasn't around long enough to be any influence on her life. I actually meant myself. Her chuckle was self-deprecating. I was rebellious, stubborn, and boy crazy at that age too. I must have driven my mom mad. I know she was deeply disappointed in me when I ended up pregnant at 16, but she never lectured me. She just stood by me and offered help when I needed it. I want to be that kind of mom, but I first want to make sure Tyla doesn't interfere with her own potential by doing something stupid like getting pregnant. Jody nodded in sympathy, certain it must be a difficult situation. It was yet another reason she was glad she'd never had children. Other people's kids were fine in small doses, and Tyla was a teenager who was starting to seem more like an adult, so Jody could engage with her well enough, but she'd never had patience or skill the little ones. She doubted she'd handle teenage rebellion very gracefully either, unlike Aoife, who seemed to have it all in hand. Do you know there's a red thing living in our supply room? Jody blurted out the question. Aoife paused in the process of closing her bag and gave Jody a look. You're just now meeting bees? She nodded. I have a feeling he hadn't planned to introduce himself yet, but he didn't know I was here. He was louder than he probably would have been otherwise. Then he was annoyed that I interrupted his selfie. Aoife flashed what appeared to be an affectionate grin. He's obsessed with his social media presence, you know? Jody shook her head. She didn't know, and she didn't understand it either. You're telling me that little demon is interested in social media? He practically lives for it. I think maybe it satisfies his demonic need to be worshipped and adored. It seems to be ingrained in their personality, at least in some of them. She shrugged. He's lived here the whole time you've been a deputy? Aoife nodded. He's been here as long as I can remember. He used to be here when I was a little girl. I used to see him getting ice cream at the ice cream truck when I was small, before the business folded, and the family who owned the truck moved away. Jody's mind was having difficulty comprehending a place where it was perfectly acceptable to see a 2-foot, red-skinned creature strolling around town and ordering ice cream alongside the kiddies. Her headache was growing exponentially, like the kind she got right before Aunt Flo paid a visit, though she wasn't expecting the monthly curse just yet. She turned away from Aoife. I'll be in my office. The last sheriff used to like to take a little afternoon nap. Aoife chuckled. Sometimes, he got an early start and began around 10. I have no intention of napping in the office, said Jody repressively. It would be completely unprofessional. Aoife nodded, but she still seemed amused and certainly not repentant at the idea of suggesting it to start with. With a sigh, Jody returned to her office, closed the door, and drew the blinds. It was still too light in there for her headache, but it was much better in the dimness, and she sat down in her chair, leaning back with her eyes closed. She just wanted to rest a little and let her headache fade. She definitely wasn't going to nap. Jody woke with a jolt, embarrassed as she realized she had fallen asleep in the office despite her protestations otherwise. She was further embarrassed to realize there was a trail of drool hanging down her chin, and the embarrassment got even worse when she realized what had woken her was the sound of someone entering her office. She blinked as she leaned forward and clicked on the lamp, providing better illumination while wiping at her chin. She sucked in a reluctant breath of appreciation as she eyed the handsome behemoth in front of her. He was tall and solidly muscled, with tanned skin, closely cropped black hair, and sparkling brown eyes that had the oddest hint of red as an undertone. He wore a sleeveless vest made of leather, along with leather pants, and he could have been a bad biker cliché, save for his air of seriousness. There didn't seem to be anything macho fake about him, and she was finding it difficult to look away. If you're done staring, Sheriff, maybe we can get down to business. He spoke in a smooth voice that was deep with just a hint of bass. It was the perfect match for his facade, and she imagined it could turn any woman's insides to goo. Any woman but her. She was irritated by his words and his ill manners at calling out her staring. She cleared her throat as she slid back the chair and stood up, thankfully remembering to move the chair back this time before she dumped herself on her butt in front of her visitor. Who are you, and what boosine SS do we have? I'm Draken Abaddon. He nodded to her in a haphazard way, which was difficult to tell if it was meant to be a show of respect or simply an acknowledgement that she was listening. I'm Sheriff Shaw. For a moment, she debated about holding out her hand, but she really didn't want him to touch her. It wasn't because she found him repulsive in any way. In fact, she found him far too appealing, and she wanted to keep a level and steady head. Who are you, and what is our business? She asked again. Bees said you were bad with details. I guess he wasn't kidding. She glared at him. Your name is Draken Abaddon. I got that, but what business do we have, and perhaps I should ask what your position is in my town rather than who you were if you want to split hairs and be pedantic. He eyed her for a moment as though assessing her. One of his eyebrows arched upward, and he chuckled lightly. He was clearly amused, and she had a feeling it was at her expense. You're certainly different from the last sheriff. Yes, I suppose I am. Who are you, and what do you want? How many times was she going to have to repeat that? You already know my name. His brown eyes sparkled, as though he wanted to tell her again anyway. Likely, he detected her impatience, and he seemed like the type who would thrive on pissing her off. This is just a courtesy call to let you know I'm in town chasing an escapee. He made it all sound routine, but she frowned. What kind of escapee? From where? She was half expecting him to say the old asylum that she'd heard about at Miller Point, but that had been closed for at least half a century. Hell. She shook her head. That's impossible. Draken looked vaguely annoyed now. It is possible, I assure you. I'm sure you know by now there's a hell gate right at the center of Harrow Bay? Sometime this morning, Harold Stanton dragged himself from the depths of hell and entered Harrow Bay. She frowned. How is that even possible? Shouldn't the hell gate be closed? He looked around for a moment, as though seeing if they were being observed. After a second, he gave a half shrug. Officially, it remains a mystery. Unofficially, I suspect Luke likes giving them some hope of escape, torturing them with it, and then reeling them back in to curtail their freedom even more. She drew her brows together in confusion. Who's Luke? He gave her look of exasperation. Do I really need to tell you that? She started to say yes and complain about his tone, but it struck her that he must be referring to one particular Luke. Are you talking about Lucifer? At his nod, she shook her head. As in the devil, Lucifer Morningstar? Beelzebub, Satan, and a host of other names. That's the one. As far as I know, he prefers Luke. He seemed far too casual about that. She crossed her arms over her chest. Have you met him? The devil, I mean? He laughed. I certainly didn't think you meant Neil Diamond. Yeah, I've met him and spent quite a bit of time with him as a child, though most of my assignments come from an intermediary. Jody realized she wasn't up for this conversation just yet, so she sank into her chair and rubbed her forehead. Her impromptu nap had served to lessen the pain, but it was flaring anew. Intermediary for what assignments? I'm a bounty hunter. There's a slew of us, and we pursue the fugitives. We drag them back to hell for suitable punishment and confinement. It's probably all part of some grand design of torture, though I couldn't tell you if me being a bounty hunter casts me as the torturer, or if it's a form of torture directed toward me. She eyed him warily then. Are you damned or something? He laughed. Or something. I just find it easier to live in my father's world than my mother's. Jody didn't follow. I'm not sure what that means. He seemed vaguely exasperated. It means my father is a demon, and my mother was human. Now, about this escapee. Jody couldn't help letting out a shrill sound of disbelief as she rolled back a few inches on her chair to put space between them. You're a demon? He shrugged. Half demon, if you want to get into semantics. Like bees? Draken scowled. Not at all like bees. He's a completely different race and an annoying little putz. His kind of demon doesn't get as big as mine. That invited a second examination of his fine form, and Jody realized she was about to ogle him again seconds before she began. She short-circuited the urge and kept her eyes focused on his. What am I supposed to do about an escapee from hell in Harrow Bay? For the most part, you probably won't have to do anything. I'm just being professional telling you I'm here, and that there's a new fugitive. I'll call on you if I need you. His imperious tone didn't sit well with her, and she crossed her arms over her chest as she glared at him. I work for the people of Harrow Bay, not you or hell. I don't plan to be at your beck and call, Mr. Abaddon. Drake. She blinked. Excuse me? He sighed. I prefer Drake. Very well, Drake, I'm not your beck and call girl. His lips twitched. I suppose you could be with a few acid enhancements, and maybe a little Botox, honest to goodness, Her hand spasmed as she reached for her gun before she could think better of it. Somehow, she restrained the urge to remove it from the holster and fire it at him. Thanks for the heads up. Now get out. He lifted his hands. I was just teasing, Sheriff Shaw. You look pretty good for a woman your age. You must be around 40? She eyed him through a narrowed gaze. If our business is done, we're finished. It's done unless I need your help with Stanton. He turned away from her but paused to look over his shoulder and wink at her. Have a lovely afternoon, Sheriff Shaw. Jody glared after him before getting to her feet. She wanted to make sure he exited the sheriff's station, unsettled by his presence and annoyed by his words. As she walked out of the office, she realized Aoife was staring after Drake, who was exiting the front. She looked at her deputy. You know him? I do. He's some kind of demon bounty hunter, and the boy has a butt that doesn't quit. I can see that. How could she deny it, getting a good glimpse of the leather-clad protrusion as he departed? It was supple and taut, and just the kind of bum a woman could admire, but unfortunately, he was a gigantic butt overall. He doesn't spend much time here, does he? Aoife shrugged. I suppose it depends on the case he's working. Why? I found him overbearing, irritating, and just plain rude. Aoife frowned. Really? He's never been like that with me. She shrugged. I wouldn't have imagined he had it in him. Maybe you're too busy staring at his butt to notice the rest of his negative attributes, said Jody with a hint of irritation. If Aoife was offended, she didn't show it. Instead, she just laughed. Maybe so, Jody. Either way, I don't mind the days he visits. It provides nice eye candy and livens up things around here. Yeah, it has been kind of dead. Is it always like that? Aoife shrugged again. It just varies depending on the day and the phase of the moon. Jody wasn't certain whether she should find that reassuring or alarming. She decided not to probe too deeply and to take it one day at a time. One thing was certain, and that was she had never anticipated being bored in a town like Harrow Bay. So far, the paranormal aspect hadn't lived up to the hype at all. Chapter 5. Isabel. One thing Isabel found irritating about being in her late 70s was she was the same age as old people. Intellectually, she knew people would consider her old, but she didn't feel that way. Oh, there were times when her sciatica acted up, or her hip reminded her she certainly wasn't 17 anymore, or her knees hurt, but mentally, she still felt like a young girl embarking on life for the first time. That naturally drew her to a younger crowd, but after a week of living in Harrow Bay, she was forced to face the intolerable truth. If she wanted to make friends, she was going to have to darken the doors of the senior center. She'd tried a few other connections already, including a book club, but all the women had wanted to do was whine while drinking wine and complaining about their husbands and children. Isabel could have devoted an entire book to complaining about her ex-husband, though they'd technically only been together a few short months before he'd hit her for the first, and last, time. She'd walked out on him after knocking him flat with a cast iron skillet, but she hadn't been able to obtain a divorce for 12 years. Still, she preferred not to dwell in the past or think about her old mistakes, so that group hadn't been compatible. Willa had suggested she might check out classes at the craft center, but that idea bored Isabel to tears. She wasn't the kindly grandma who sat around crocheting all day. There also didn't seem to be any active political causes being organized, and if there were charitable opportunities, she had yet to find them. That led her to the grocery store, and the clerk had recommended she try the senior center when she'd seen Isabel eyeing the corkboard at the entryway that announced various activities happening around Harrow Bay. Isabel had felt offended at first, but she'd reined in the impulse to snap at the clerk's inadvertent reminder that she looked like she belonged with the senior crowd. Just because she felt like she wouldn't mean anyone else would know that. At first, she'd scoffed at the idea and dismissed it out of hand, but here she was, 2 days later, about to enter the Harrow Bay Senior Center. Desperate times called for desperate measures, she supposed, as she walked up the marble steps. It was a point of pride to eschew the wheelchair ramp, and she was also glad to be moving freely without a cane or walker. She fully expected to be surrounded by a bunch of old sticks in the mud, But maybe it would give her a chance to get out of the house and find something she enjoyed doing, even if it meant putting up with a bunch of old people. When she stepped inside, she had barely been there for a few seconds when a woman with clearly too much energy, a perky grin, and bouncy boobs rushed forward to greet her. She held out her hand, which was thin, sparrow-like, and could have easily belonged to a mummy or a woman twice her age. "Hello, I'm Kay Ballinger. Welcome to our senior center. You must be the sheriff's mother?" "Grandmother," Isabel corrected. "But I'm not old." Kay's eyes widened, and she seemed like she might smile until she looked closer. Apparently, Isabel's death glare dared her to reveal any amusement. Instead, she cleared her throat. "I see." She waved around. "Do come in and allow me to show you around. I'll introduce you to Sally, and you can make a good impression on her." She lowered her voice in a conspiratorial fashion. "Once you're in with Sally, you're in." Isabel frowned at the idea of having to impress someone, and she wondered if there was a committee set up for membership at the senior center. She'd never spent much time at the one near their house in Woodburn, but she'd always thought it was somewhere people could come and go freely. Was this a senior center or a country club? Kay showed her around, taking Ns to point out even the most utilitarian function and make it sound like it was the best thing ever. It was just another boring senior center, and there was nothing particularly remarkable about it, but Kay was clearly proud of it, as though she'd built it all herself from the ground up and laid it brick by brick. "And here is the main room," said Kay with a chipper tone as she pushed open the set of glass doors and gestured for Isabel to precede her. "This is where most of our members spend their time. Over there's the main table." She waved to the long table that had to seat at least 12, and there was a white-haired old granny sitting at the head of it. She had flawless posture, and her hair was combed into a bun that looked like it didn't dare stray in the breeze. Perhaps she'd ordered a lifetime supply of Aqua Net while it was still available, because her hair was practically a helmet. Kay whispered again, "Remember, get in good with Sally, and you're in." Isabel frowned, finding the whole idea off-putting, but she tried to behave herself as she approached. Kay hovered for a moment, waiting for Sally to notice her. Isabel was certain the other woman had, but she seemed to be deliberately making Kay wait for acknowledgement as she finished talking about the time she'd canned 357 jars of corn. Isabel didn't bother to smother a yawn, though she probably appeared rude. She crossed her arms over her chest and started tapping her toe as she waited for the interminable story to finally wind down. Sally deigned to look at them then. She smiled with the air of a regal queen bestowing a favor upon her subject as she nodded to Kay. "Hello, Kay, do you need something? I wanted to introduce our new member. She just recently moved to Harrow Bay, along with the sheriff." Kay seemed excited by that, as though she might burst into spontaneous applause at any moment. "This is Isabel Shaw Campbell," said Isabel automatically. "I never took my husband's name, and I sure as heck wasn't going to take my son-in-law's." Sally had looked like she was beneficent for a moment, but then she stiffened, and by the time she was fully looking at Isabel, her roomy gray eyes were narrowed and shrewish. "Did you say Campbell?" Her tone wasn't entirely cold, but it certainly wasn't polite. Isabel nodded. "Isabel Campbell?" As Isabel nodded, her lips tightened, and her dentures visibly slid a little bit to the side. "Did you used to live here?" "Yeah, many years ago. I was 17 when I left Harrow Bay." Like a fool, she'd followed after Andy once he knocked her up. It had seemed like the thing she had to do then, but that was before she got smart and realized her identity didn't have to be entangled with a man's. Sally sniffed at her and looked away. There was a gasp that moved quietly through the room, starting with the other men and women sitting around the table before spreading outward like a contagious virus. Isabel looked around, baffled by the reaction. She was further bewildered when Kay looked distraught. "Oh, dear," said Kay softly, shaking her head. She sent Isabel a mournful stare as she wrapped her arm through hers and started to tug her lightly from table. "Come along, dear." Isabel allowed the director to lead her for a few feet before she dug in her heels. "What in the world is going on? Sally has given you the dreaded cut." Isabel's mouth dropped open. "Seriously? Who is she, Beau Brummel? Seeing Kay's look of complete confusion, she shook her head at the woman's lack of historical knowledge. What does that mean, that she gave me the cut? She's made it clear to everyone that she has no intention of associating with you. Of course, you can still come to the senior center, and you're able to participate in any solo activities, but you just won't have very much fun without the others. Accepting you. Kay sounded like it was the end of the world. Oh, I did impress upon you the need to get Sally's favor. Isabel rolled her eyes. What are we, in high school? With a sniff of irritation, she pulled away from Kay's gentle hold on her arm and marched back to Sally. The other woman was determinedly looking away from her, but Isabel was tired of playing childish games, and they'd just begun. With a huffing sound, she reached for Sally's wheelchair, tugging on it, and forcing the woman to face her. What is your problem with me, lady? You're a man-stealing, shameless hussy. Isabel didn't think that quite described her. She'd never stolen anyone's man, though she supposed she could be shameless. As for hussy, if she were, she took pride in that. And? Sally's mouth dropped open, and her dentures wobbled again. You tried to steal my boyfriend. Isabel blinked. When would I do that? Prom, 61 years ago. I was there with Bill Gilling, and he talked to you at the punch table. You made him laugh, and you touched his arm. Isabel blinked, struggling to recall the incident, or even bring forth a mental image of Bill Gilling. It was a complete blank. I don't remember that at all. Of course, you wouldn't. It wasn't your life that was destroyed. Sally blinked. Isabel started to feel a stirring of guilt, though she had no idea what she'd done. How did that ruin your life? She was struggling to sound genuinely curious and sympathetic rather than exasperated. He told me how kind and pretty you were. Then he proposed. She blinked, and tears ran down her cheeks. Isabel was completely confused. How did that ruin your life? Did you not want to marry him? Certainly, I did. We were happily married for many years. Sally drew herself up in her chair. He tainted that memory with talk of you first. I couldn't stand it. I always knew you were a loose woman and not worth any time spent on you, but your blatant behavior just confirmed it for me. I highly doubt anything has changed in the time you've been gone. Isabel couldn't help laughing. That was more than 60 years ago, Mrs. Gilling. I think we've both changed and surely grown up by now. Sally sniffed at her. I can assume nothing of the kind. You're not welcome here, Miss Campbell. She tittered then. Why am I not surprised you never got married? Had she missed the moments where Isabel already mentioned her husband, or was Sally forgetful? Oh, I got married. I was just smart enough to leave him. Isabel realized she was on the verge of justifying her actions and her life choices to this woman, and she had no intention of doing that. Instead, she threw her hands in the air. You might think you're queen of the senior center, but prepare yourself for a coup, Sally Gilling. With those words, she turned and walked out of the room, almost shaking in anger. How petty and ridiculous could someone be, to hold a conversation she'd had with a man 60 years ago, one she couldn't even remember but sounded perfectly innocuous, against her now? It seemed like Sally was determined to ruin her social success with the senior center. While Isabel wasn't overly upset about the idea of a bunch of old people not liking her, she wasn't about to let Sally's smear campaign stand. The woman needed to be knocked down a few pegs, and Isabel was just the one to do it. I'm sorry about that, said a shaky older voice behind her. Isabel stiffened as she turned around, surprised to find herself looking into the warm blue eyes of a still attractive man. He had to be in his 80s, but he'd aged well. She frowned. You mean Sally? He nodded. She's got herself a regular little dictatorship here. He sounded regretful. Maybe I could buy you some pie and tell you about it? It had been a while since a man tried to pick her up. And Isabel was annoyed by that it had been so long, not that a man was trying. She plastered on a happy smile as she threaded her arm through his. She had no objection to keeping company with the man, and she didn't intend to allow Sally Gilling to ruin that opportunity. I'd be delighted. What's your name, honey? I'm Art. I'm Isabel, Artie, but some of my friends call me Belle. She lowered her voice slightly and stroked her fingers down the back of his hand, which was wrinkled and marred with liver spots. No one was perfect. Usually my close, intimate friends. For a moment, Artie looked surprised, but then he smiled. I hope we become close enough for me to use that name, Miss Campbell. She almost rolled her eyes at his insistence on formality. You can call me Isabel, at least for now. She winked at him as they exited the senior center and walked down the street. It required turning a block onto Main Street, but they were soon at Avis's diner. He was truly an old-world gentleman, holding out his arm and opening the door for her. He insisted on helping her push in her chair when they were seated, and Isabel didn't bother to tell him she'd always found that sort of fussing overdone and somewhat condescending. He had the scoop on Sally, and he was happy to share it. While they had pie, peach for her and lemon meringue for him since his teeth weren't as reliable as they used to be, he told her what he knew of Sally Gilling's life, and how she'd come to dominate the senior center. It boiled down to her strong-willed personality, Kay's refusal to interfere in the events of the members, and a bunch of kowtowing and scraping from the other members who looked up to Sally and accepted her word on things. She carries some weight of authority, you know. Bill was the pastor here for 48 years, after all. Isabel frowned. I don't remember religion being much of importance to life here. He shrugged. You were just a teenager when you left, and if your folks weren't in with the churches, you probably never noticed. People can be just as fervent in their beliefs here as anywhere else. In fact, it tends to make some of them a little more zealous, what with proof that there's a hell and all. Isabel nodded, conceding that point. She'd just never paid much attention to it while she lived in the town. Can she be undermined? Artie shrugged. I don't really know. I don't like how she treats people, and she already looks down on me. So, you haven't lost anything by aligning yourself with her sworn enemy. Isabel used a teasing tone as she offered that theory. He shrugged and blushed. That, and you sure are pretty. There's something about you that lights up the room, Miss Isabel. Though he was a bit too sweet and old-fashioned for her, she couldn't deny how flattering that was, particularly coupled with the look of admiration he was shooting her way. With a throaty chuckle, she leaned closer and lowered her voice, saying, Do you have a room to yourself, Artie? His eyes widened for a moment, and he nodded. I have a roommate, but he's my grandson. He works nights. Does that mean he's sleeping right now? At Artie's nod, she said, If someone told you that you had to be quiet, could you? Artie appeared a little slow on the uptake, but suddenly, what she was suggesting seemed to click, and his eyes widened. It's been a while since I've had such a challenge, but I suppose I could. What do you say we see how I light up your room while we have a little fun with each other and figure out the best way to bring down Sally Gilling? At Art's eager nod, she dug $20 from her purse and dropped it on the table, ignoring his insistence he would pay, and dragged him to his feet. Isabel couldn't decide which she was more excited about, having a new lover since it had been so long, or the opportunity to scheme and plot against Sally Gilling, whose downfall was her new pet project. Chapter 6. Jody. A few days later, Jody looked up at a knock on her door. Come in. The door opened a moment later, and Aoife stuck her head in. We've had a call from the Santiri compound. There's been a murder, and I figured you might want to come along. Jody pushed back her chair and stood up. This was her first murder in Harrow Bay. She certainly wasn't excited, but it was good to be doing something again. Let's go. She followed Aoife out of the office, and they walked to the parking lot. Michael was already waiting in a squad car, and Aoife got behind the wheel. Jody got into her SUV, and it was only after she was following them that she thought maybe she should have ridden with her deputies instead. It would have given them a chance to apprise her of the situation and tell her about the Santiri compound. It sounded ominous and cult-like, and she braced herself to find something like that. Time and distance sometimes felt like it moved differently here, for it seemed like no time at all had passed when they exited from the main road and turned down a private lane labeled Santiri Drive. There were several signs posted to warn away trespassers. Jody hadn't been sure what to expect, but at first glance, The Santiri compound appeared to be nothing more than a large farm, save for the tall gate drawn across the entrance and completely fenced area surrounding it. Someone must have been watching for them, because the entrance gate swung open a second later without either of them having to do anything. Aoife maintained the lead, and Jody pulled in behind her. The gate closed behind her with an ominous clink, and she shivered slightly at the sound, though there was no overt threat at the moment. Still, she was in an unknown area to deal with a murder, so she couldn't assume everything was safe. Aoife was taking a slow and steady pace, and Jody was able to keep up with her despite some of the rough ruts in the road. The drive seemed to go for miles, but eventually they turned a corner, and there was a structure in front of them. They stopped in front of a sprawling home. There was a collection of buildings scattered around it, and she could see why it had gained the name of a compound. A man stood on the porch, and he had a tense, wide set of his shoulders. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair, and even, attractive features. It was only after she'd stepped from her car and approached that she realized his eyes completely lacked color. They were somewhat disturbing yet equally compelling. He also had a neatly trimmed beard that was more salt than pepper, and a quiet, yet commanding confidence about him as they walked up the stairs to meet him. He nodded to Aoife and Michael. "Thanks for coming. We always come for a rogue vampire attack." Aoife sounded relatively calm. Jody stiffened then. "Vampires? You didn't mention anything about that, Aoife." Aoife's tone was soothing. "I wasn't trying to spring it on you, Jody. I figured you might take the information better once we arrived." She'd figured wrong, but Jody didn't feel like arguing. She just nodded sharply at her deputy before turning to the man who'd greeted them. Michael introduced them. "Sheriff Shaw, this is Ryland Santiri. He's in charge here." He was probably compelling in other situations, but right now, he just looked pale and worried. "I wish we could have met under better circumstances, Sheriff." Jody nodded. "What's going on here?" Val went feral. He sounded defeated. "Who's Val?" asked Aoife. "A newcomer. He found us a little while ago, and we took him in. He'd been on his own before, and I suspect he'd been drinking human blood. He had a hard time adjusting to animal blood, though he never really told us. It was just something I observed. I've seen them go feral enough that I wasn't exactly surprised. But I didn't expect him to have an opportunity to hurt someone here at the compound." "What happened?" asked Jody. "We had a delivery. The gatekeeper let in the driver like normal, and Val attacked him before any of us could stop it." He sounded regretful as he waved for them to follow him around to the back of the house. The smell hit Jody before the sight, and though she'd been on duty during a few murders, they couldn't prepare her for what they saw as they rounded the corner. She stumbled to a halt and gasped, clutching her hand to her mouth as she fought against nausea. She could tell it had once been a UPS driver by the uniform, but that was the only thing recognizable. Not only had the feral vampire drained the blood of the victim, he'd torn him to pieces in the process. She had the urge to vomit, and only seeing how calm Michael and Aoife were kept her from giving in to the urge. The driver had died bloodily. She shuddered. What could do such a thing? "Feral vampires don't have any sense of self or control," said Ryland grimly. "I knew he was struggling, but he didn't reach out for help, and we can only help so much if they don't want it. My instinct was to send him on his way, and I should have listened to that." Jody was still just trying to comprehend what she saw in front of her. She couldn't offer any comfort to the leader of the vampires. What happened here is tragic, but by keeping Val at the compound, at least he's only responsible for one murder and not many. Michael sounded convinced of that. After a moment, Ryland nodded slowly. "Yeah, I suppose that's true. If he was snacking on human blood before he came to us, it was only a matter of time before he lost control and drained a victim." He shuddered. "For all I know, he already has." "Do you vampires go feral often?" Jody's hand hovered on the butt of her Smith & Wesson as she asked, mentally imagining a wave of vampires suddenly pouring from the buildings around her, all intent on tearing her apart. He was clearly annoyed by the question, but his tone remained respectful when he said, "None of my native people have gone feral." If you're born or converted here, you start out on animal blood from the beginning. If you've never known anything else, it's easier to adapt. In Val's case, I suspect he's been sustaining himself by drinking the blood of humans whenever he had the chance. What do we do now? Jody directed the question to Aoife, feeling completely out of her depth with this situation. We usually handle it in-house, said Ryland before Aoife could answer. He sounded grim. Jody arched a brow as she glanced at him again. What does that mean? We'll incinerate the body parts, and we'll deal with Val. She frowned. What? We'll stake him. Ryland seemed mildly ill at the prospect. Jody shook her head. I can't allow you to just kill someone. Something. It's justice, and our laws are far older than humans' rules. He broke them, so we'll deal with him. Ryland crossed his arms over his chest as he stared down at her. Jody squared her shoulders as she stared back just as hard. I don't know how you did things before, but I'm the new sheriff, and I'm not okay with vigilante justice. She ignored his grimace. I'd like to see the perpetrator. You should just let them handle it, said Aoife softly. Jody's shoulders stiffened more as she turned to look at her senior deputy. That's not my style. Where I come from, you don't just kill someone because of a crime they committed. Surely, he's entitled to a fair trial from his peers? You're among his peers, Sheriff Shaw, and there's no need for a trial. He was caught in the act. Ryland looked grim. Jody straightened her shoulders once more, convinced her spine might snap in the process. I'm sorry, but that's unacceptable. Now take M.E. to this, Val. Ryland seemed poised to argue for a moment, but then he sighed and nodded instead. Very well, Jody. Aoife started to say. Jody put up a hand, quieting her deputy's warning before it could be uttered. I would like to see him now, please. She spoke with a note of authority that dared Ryland to defy her. To her surprise, he didn't seem to plan to do so. Instead, he turned away and said, "Follow me." Jody was glad to be away from the murder scene, and once fresh air washed away the scent of copper from her nostrils, she felt less inclined to vomit as she followed. They bypassed the main building and several of the smaller ones before reaching one that was somewhat isolated. It had shiny doors, and Jody ventured to guess it might be silver by the way Ryland stopped nearby and donned a pair of thick gloves that were hanging from a post driven into the ground. So, the silver thing is true? Ryland nodded at her question. It's a particularly severe form of allergy for us once we're converted. It's even worse for the born vampires. Jody had a million questions, and she wished she had time to indulge them all. But then Ryland was opening the door, and she could hear the animalistic growls coming from inside. It sent a shiver down her spine, and her instincts were telling her to run away. She consciously fought the caveman reaction as she rested her hand on her gun and followed Ryland into the dark recesses of the room. There was a single bulb burning in its socket suspended from the ceiling, and it provided enough illumination to highlight the figure bound underneath it. He was wrapped in silver chains that immobilized him, and he was letting out a keening cry, but it didn't seem to be caused by the burning he must surely feel from the silver touching his skin, judging by the way it smoked faintly and the smell of cooked flesh permeating the air. Was he like this before? He's been like this since we caught up with him and dragged him back. He's truly gone feral. If you're asking if he was like this before he killed the driver, the answer is no. He was always restless and twitchy, and it was obvious he was struggling to fit in at the compound and adjust to the cow blood we usually drink, but he wasn't this far gone. Once they go feral, it flips a switch, and there's no coming back from it. I've never seen anyone recover from being feral in the 500 years I've been a vampire. Her eyes widened at the news that Ryland, who looked to be in his mid-50s, was actually in his 500s, and at the realization he didn't believe there was anything that could reverse Val's state. Are there treatments for feral vampires? We've tried in the past, but they always fail. It's an irreversible state, Sheriff Shaw. The kindest thing we can do for him is stake him now. It saves others, and it stops his torment. Jody got a little closer, wanting to look into the murderer's eyes. She instantly regretted it, finding they were the same colorless state as Ryland's, but somehow emptier. When he looked back at her, all she saw was hunger, violence, and naked need. If there were any remnants of humanity left inside him, they must be buried deep beneath whatever had taken possession of him. With a sigh, she stepped back as Val started to lunge for her, though he couldn't move very far forward due to the way he was chained. Apparently, he seemed to have caught the scent of her blood, because his eyes widened, his nostrils flared, and he let out another keening cry that sent shivers down her spine while hurting her ears. She eased back until she realized she was about to hit Aoife and Michael, who stood shoulder to shoulder. It was comforting when they both reached out to put a hand on her shoulders, squeezing in unspoken communication. She understood now why previous sheriffs had allowed the vampires to handle such matters themselves. He nodded to Ryland. Do it. Obviously, he didn't have to inquire exactly what she meant. He went to the wall, fetching a sharp-looking piece of silver that had been cast into a stake, along with a short-handled sledgehammer. There was resigned sadness about him as he approached the chained vampire. Val tried to lunge for him, though he was incapacitated. Ryland nudged him on the shoulder, causing the feral vampire to fall backward due to his precarious perch. He appeared unaware of the danger coming toward him. Instead, Val's gaze had come to rest on Jody and her deputies, and he was clearly trying to fight the silver chains to get to them. Jody hoped he remained mostly unaware of what was happening to him. Ryland knelt beside the feral vampire, placed the silver stake against his chest right above his heart, and drove down the sledgehammer with one sharp motion. He must have phenomenal strength, because it penetrated straight through the vampire's chest, pinning the creature to the ground. Val let out one pitiful howl of agony before going silent, and all movement ceased. You might want to look away. That advice came from Michael. Jody wished she could, but she had to see it all. She couldn't explain the need, other than having to face the reality of the situation where she lived. She had to see this through. She watched as Ryland set aside the sledgehammer and removed the stake, wiping it on Val's shirt before returning it to the wall. Then he grasped a long-handled knife with a wicked blade, and she was certain what was coming, yet she still couldn't look away. Even as Ryland brought down the blade and severed the vampire's head from his body, she was compelled to watch. Dark blood sank into the straw covering the ground, and it wasn't quite the right consistency for fresh blood. Whatever made a vampire obviously changed their coagulation abilities among other things. We'll burn him on the pyre with the remains of the driver, said Ryland as he wiped off the machete before returning it to the wall along with the sledgehammer and stake. He was covered in splatters of blood, but he seemed unaffected by the evidence of what he'd just done. Not that he appeared to have performed the task easily or casually. Jody was still wary, afraid bloodlust might seize the vampire at any moment. Once you've cleaned up, I want to talk to you. He nodded his acceptance before stepping away from the body. Come back to the main house. I'll have Megan make you some coffee while you wait. Jody couldn't imagine sitting around drinking coffee surrounded by vampires, but she somehow found herself doing that very thing less than 10 minutes later. They were gathered at a long table that looked like it had been made from a slab of old-growth timber. It fit the homey and rustic decor of the inside of the compound's main house, and the chubby older woman who'd made their coffee seemed perfectly at home with the arrangement. Wearing a flannel shirt and with her white hair confined in a bun, she certainly didn't look like a vampire. Yet she must be to live here, right? Jody found herself wanting to know more, but in the awkward position of being uncertain how to broach the subject. She finally decided she just had to plunge in, so she said to Megan, "You seem at home here." Megan nodded. "I've been at the compound for almost 100 years. That answered her question about whether she was a vampire. Do any humans live here? Megan shook her head. No, it's easier if they don't. People who come to Ryland or are found by him don't want to live by the ancient ways. They want to find balance and harmony with humanity, not look at them as a food source. Still, it would be far too much temptation to have one of them living alongside us. Do you have situations like this often? I mean murders by your people?" Megan stiffened slightly, but she shook her head. "We've only dealt with a handful of ferals over the time I've been here. Usually, the vampires are too far gone when they come to join us, or there's someone Ryland found and wanted to try to save. He'd like to save all the vampires and the humans, for the boy has a bleeding heart, and he doesn't like to accept the fact that some people can't be saved. She sounded maternal. That's admirable, but his need to save vampires who can't be saved puts my town at risk. As she spoke, Jody realized she was feeling protective of Harrow Bay. She hadn't even been there 2 weeks yet, but she was already starting to feel like it was home, and it was certainly her responsibility to protect the people within it. That was what she was paid to do, but it was beginning to become far more than that. Megan shrugged. You would have to discuss that with Ryland. She looked uneasy for the first time in their presence. If you'll excuse me, I have things to do. She set down her coffee cup and moved away from the table, disappearing from the room. Clearly, she hadn't been assigned to guard them as Jody had half wondered. If you don't mind, I'll head back to the station, said Michael. He stretched. We're going to have to file an accident report for the driver. I'm thinking the truck blew up, and no remains were identifiable. Jody frowned. Now we have to falsify police reports too? Aoife reached over and patted her shoulder. It's part of the job here in Harrow Bay. We're protecting our people, but we're also keeping secrets the rest of the world isn't ready to learn. At least this way, the driver's family gets closure, and they know he died. He won't mysteriously disappear, but they have nothing to bury. Why can't we? Jody trailed off before she even bothered to finish uttering the question. It was patently obvious why they couldn't return the remains. Any competent coroner would realize the cause of death was far more than a simple auto accident. Perhaps there was even a risk of contagion remaining in the victim's blood. She sighed again but nodded. Thanks, Michael. If you don't mind, leave a copy on my desk so I can look it over. I guess I need to learn how you go about altering the events of reality. She hated that she already sounded jaded about the possibility, but what choice was there? Aoife looked hesitant for a moment before saying, I really need to pick up Jason after school. Jody's blood ran cold at the idea of being left here alone. Seriously? You're going to abandon me here? Aoife frowned. I know you're uncertain still, but you truly are safe here. Jody arched a brow. I'm certain the UPS driver thought that too up until the point he was ripped apart by one of the ferals. Aoife pulled out her phone. Let me see if I can get one of the other moms to give Jason a ride home. After a moment, Jody shook her head. No, that's okay. You don't need to be here holding my hand, and I suppose that if someone did go feral, there's not much the two of us could do together. Perhaps not. Aoife cleared her throat. I'd suggest you get your bullets from the armory though. Jody shifted in her seat. What do you mean? Aoife reached into her gun belt, pulling out her gun. She discharged the clip to reveal the bullets inside. They had the same hint of shininess that the silver doors and stake had. We have access to silver bullets. I always carry a clip of these along with a clip of regular bullets. So does Michael. It's pretty much standard, and I'm sorry I didn't think to tell you beforehand. That's all right. She held out her hand. Why don't you give me that clip since you're leaving, and you can get a new one when you get back to the station? Aoife seemed reluctant to hand it over, but she didn't argue. She took the clip Jody removed from her gun and put it back in hers instead. Okay, then I'm going to go pick up Jason. Jody nodded, watching Aoife leave and trying not to feel like she'd been deserted. Somehow, she was aware of Ryland's approach even before he entered the room. He made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and she assumed that was some remnant of humanity's days of living a far less civilized existence when they'd had to rely on their wits and instincts. Something inside her was whispering he was a predator, but she forced herself to ignore the instinct to run as he took a seat near her. To her surprise, he poured himself a cup of coffee and started drinking it. I didn't think you actually drank coffee. I thought Megan was just going through the motions. He smiled. We don't have to drink or eat, but there's no reason we can't. It also helps manage any cravings and reduce the need for blood to sustain us. By eating regular meals, we can reduce our consumption to 2 or 3 liters of cow's blood per week. She nodded as she filed away the information. What about garlic? It's another allergen for us. It has anticoagulant properties. We can survive it, but it isn't pleasant. It doesn't cause quite the same reaction that silver does, since silver is always fatal. What about holy water and crosses? Jody fiddled with her coffee cup but didn't lift it to her lips as she waited for his answer. He seemed amused by the questions, as though they weren't discussing ways she could kill him. I'm afraid that's an old wives' tale. Humans like to link everything to religion, but vampires don't exist because of curses or magic. We're just a different bloodline than humans. However, we do carry an enzyme that can be transmitted to humans and make them vampires if they're exposed to enough of it. So, you think your compound is safe? He leaned closer, providing her a waft of his scent. She had expected him to smell like copper and dead things, but instead, he smelled faintly of pine and vanilla. It was a pleasing combination. My people are safe here because your people don't come after us. I know what you're really asking though is, are your people safe from mine? The answer is, mostly. Jody arched a brow. Mostly? You expect me to be okay with that? He shrugged a shoulder. It's the best I can do. I can't guarantee anything, but I can tell you that the people who live here now have been here for years, and I trust each and every one of them to be able to resist even the strongest cravings. For those who can't, we can help them manage their hunger. There's some magic involved, and if Val would have admitted how badly he was struggling, we probably could have prevented this. If not, I would have dealt with him before he could murder someone. That's one law that is non-negotiable in our compound. If you harm a human, you are going to be put down. It can also be a preemptive sentence if we realize there's no saving someone. Jody mulled it over. I still kinda want to tell you people to leave. He seemed sympathetic. I understand that, but you should understand it's not up to you. We answer to the city council, though I don't expect any leniency from you. If one of my people breaks the law, and I'm not here to deal with it, I expect you would do what you see fit. What if I have to put you down someday, Ryland? Jody wasn't certain why she uttered the question other than she wanted to see his reaction. He didn't even blink. If I happen to go feral, I hope you will. Let me assure you that I haven't felt any strong cravings for human blood in more than 200 years, and I haven't drunk from a human in more than 400. I did as a new vampire, while I was lost and making my way in the world. I even killed a few people, and you have no idea how much I regret that. It didn't seem to be just something he was paying lip service to, judging by his expression and his tone. Though it must have been more than 4 centuries since he'd committed the murders, at least by his account, he still appeared to feel guilt for them. I was lucky that another vampire took me in and showed me a better way. I'm determined to do the same and save as many of my people as I can, but I also know not everyone can be saved. Jody knew that as well, having worked in law enforcement all her adult life. Some people were just too far gone in madness, greed, or violence to be saved. She found an unexpected kinship with the leader of the vampire compound as they sipped their coffee in silence for a few minutes. Do you have any other questions? She looked up. You mentioned born? How does that work? I assume you know how babies are made? His lips twitched as he asked that, and there was a hint of flirtation in his tone. 2 natural vampires create a vampire offspring when reproducing. 1 human and 1 vampire usually produce a vampire, since it's a dominant gene, but that varies. Jody flushed under the sizzle in his eyes, not sure if she was alarmed or flattered that he was flirting with her, even in a casual way. So, does a turned vampire have a vampire if they give birth? He shook his head. A turned vampire is infertile. The process changes their body too much. The ultimate birth control, said Jody with a grin. She could see the appeal of that. Long ago, she tried to have her tubes tied, but no doctor would do it for her because she wasn't married, had no children, and was too young in their eyes. If only she'd known becoming a vampire was all it took. She shook her head and grinned at the idea while simultaneously rejecting it. She didn't have it in her to live like a bloodsucker. If there's nothing else, Sheriff, I have things to do, and I don't think you want to stick around for them. He could only be referring to the need to burn the remnants of the victim and the body of the vampire who'd killed him. She nodded as she stood up, taking her coffee cup to the sink. "Thank you for answering my questions, Ryland." She realized maybe she should be calling him Mr. Santiri, but there was an air of informality about him that invited her to bypass such rigidness. When he shook her hand, she experienced a little thrill of reaction, but she quickly schooled her expression to hide that. If he could hear her heart beating, he probably detected it suddenly jumped pace for a few beats, but she wasn't about to admit that. Jody was on the verge of leaving when Drake popped into her mind for some reason. She wanted to push the thought away, but it also reminded her he was looking for a hell fugitive. "There's maybe one more thing, Ryland." He hesitated in the process of opening the front door for her. "Yes? Do you know Drake Abaddon?" Ryland shrugged. "In passing. He's one of Luke's bounty hunters." Was everyone in this town on a first-name basis with the devil? It was a chilling thought. "He's after a fugitive, Harold Stanton." "Have you seen him?" Ryland shrugged. "I don't know. There have been a lot over the years, and it's hard to identify someone being possessed by a demon unless the demon wants you to know they're in there." He softened his tone, as though to mitigate her disappointment. "I'll have my people keep an eye out for anything unusual though." She thanked him and left, glad to be driving away from the Santiri compound several minutes later. With each mile she put between herself and the vampire's territory, she could breathe easier again. She absolutely believed Ryland was sincere, and he clearly thought everyone in his care was trustworthy, but she couldn't help recalling Megan's words that he was determined to save everyone. While Ryland appeared to be able to recognize not everyone could be saved, she wasn't confident he would necessarily recognize it in time. It left her uneasy to have vampires living so close, but he was right. The decision rested with the city council and not her. All she could do was remain vigilant and ensure his people didn't do anything to harm the residents of Harrow Bay. Once she was back in the office, Ryland's words started a new round of curiosity as she remembered he'd mentioned there were several escapees over the years. That led her to digging into Sheriff Haskins' files, and she spent the afternoon going through them. Most of the crimes and reports were the simple kind that wouldn't reveal there was any supernatural presence in town, but there were some that were creepy enough to make her second-guess the decision to stay. Interspersed among them were several notes and a few files about demons who'd escaped from hell and possessed people. Mostly, the sheriff left that to Luke's people from what she could gather from his notes, but he had been called in to assist a few times. Overall, she ended up impressed with the picture presented by his files. It led her into the basement, and she went through some of the old paper files from his predecessor and predecessors before him as well. She was pleased to see Harrow Bay seemed to be pretty self-functioning, with the creatures mostly governing themselves. There were occasions outside the norm, but the sheriffs had all stepped in to handle it quickly and efficiently. Obviously, they knew what they were dealing with, and they had prepared for it. It was a daunting prospect to fill such shoes, but she was determined to do so. Harrow Bay was starting to feel like home, and if she wanted to protect and serve the way she had to, she needed to open her eyes, accept all the realities around her, and reconcile them with her old worldview. She had to be ready to face or believe anything and act accordingly. Chapter 7. Jody. As she was coming up the stairs from her venture into the basement, she heard a shout. That sent a chill through her, and Jody removed the Smith & Wesson from her belt as she ran up the last few steps, pushed through the door, and came in low while she swept her weapon, expecting to find a threat. Instead, she saw Bees standing on Michael's desk. He was crowing about the number of hits his video had garnered. As she listened, she heard him mention something about vampires and Harrow Bay. Annoyed, she stalked forward, not returning the gun to her belt just yet. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing," he said in a sullen fashion as he started to put his phone behind his back. Jody reached out and grabbed it with her free hand, prying it from his clawed hands despite his protests. The first thing she saw was a vampiric face shying away from the camera and running, along with hearing Bees telling the viewers there had been another vampire sighting in Harrow Bay. When she saw the views had topped 100,000 already, her mouth dropped open, and she glared at him. Are you insane? You might as well advertise what's happening here. He darted forward and snatched his phone back, putting it in the carrier suspended from a belt, which was the only thing he wore. Don't be ridiculous, Sheriff Shaw. Nobody believes this stuff is real. They think I'm just CGI or made by a master puppeteer. It's all a hoax to them, but they want to believe, so they follow along and pretend. No one really believes though. Jody finally returned her gun to her belt and put her hands on her hips. You're being stupid to play this game. All it takes is one true believer, and they might blow open all the secrets of Harrow Bay. He made a snorting sound. The magic of the town's too strong for that. If someone came to discover the truth, they wouldn't see it without some help. Even if they learned it, they would forget as soon as they left town. No more videos about Harrow Bay. Nothing more about our town or our cases. Do you understand? She left no room for argument in her tone. He looked grumpy as his little red eyes glared up at her, but he gave her a sullen nod. Fine. You're the boss, Sheriff Shaw. He gave her a mocking salute. She glared at him for a moment before turning and walking away. She was on the verge of telling him to get out of the station, since she didn't trust his presence there. She still thought it was stupid to reveal the secrets of Harrow Bay on social media, and Bees was quickly wearing out his welcome with her. There was a knock on her door mid-afternoon the next day, and she called, "Come in." She was startled to see Drake stroll in, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. She frowned at him. What do you want? Do you have another escapee? There's always an escapee, but Harold Stanton is still my case. I was just dropping by to see if you'd heard anything and tell you I have a picture of the form he's possessing. Jody stood up and walked over to stand near him, not wanting him to think he was welcome to take a seat and stay a while. Let's see it. He arched a brow. You're a rather abrupt person, Sheriff. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a paper that had been folded into fourths that he passed to her. You can keep that copy, since I have others. She opened it and found herself looking at the mild-mannered demeanor of a man who could probably be in his mid-60s. He looked bland as toast, and she had a hard time believing he was a demon. There's nothing particularly evil about him, is there? Demons can hide inside other forms, and Mr. Walton is probably a perfectly fine person when he's not being possessed by a demon. With Stanton inside, you can't assume he's still placid milquetoast. She nodded her understanding. What did he do anyway? He frowned. Escape from hell. Jody rolled her eyes. I'm not an idiot. I remember that part. You never really said much about why he was in hell to start with. He seemed surprised by the question. He was in hell because he was a bad person. Evil goes to hell. Jody sighed. I'm beginning to think you're being deliberately difficult, Mr. Abaddon. Drake, he corrected with a wink. That wink sent all sorts of flutters through her stomach, and she refused to acknowledge them. I would like to know specifically what this Stanton guy did when he was still a human that sent him to hell. His expression turned serious. Yeah, I know. To be honest, I somewhat don't want to tell you. She put her hands on her hips as she glared up at him. Why? Do you think I'm too fragile to handle the reality? No. I'm afraid you're going to go out looking for him yourself and get your head handed to you, Sheriff Shaw. He glared down at her. There was something sizzling in the air between them, an awareness that went beyond the sharp and angry words, and it urged Jody to step forward. Instead, she chose the path of self-preservation and took a hearty step back, leaning against her desk instead. Just tell me, have you ever heard of the Gainesville Butcher? She shook her head. He was a particularly active serial killer in the 1860s. As you can imagine, they didn't really know about serial killers back then, and there weren't any jurisdictions working together, so he was never formally identified. Historians have posited since then a string of murders were his, and they were right, but they have no official confirmation. Of course, Luke knows exactly what he did, and so he was guaranteed an extra toasty space in hell. She licked her lips. So, you're telling me a demon who was once a serial killer is loose in my town? It's possible, but he might not even be in the area any longer. Luke has magic that makes it difficult for the escapees to get too far beyond the gates, but a few have managed it over the years. If he's strong-willed enough, and he has a high enough pain tolerance, he could be long gone by now. She frowned. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It just means he's someone else's problem if he's out in the wider world. Drake nodded. It does, so I'm hoping he's still around here. If he's ensnared by the boundaries of Luke's magic, he won't get far. I doubt he'll be able to deny his urges and hide himself for long, and I'm determined to catch him before he has a chance to hurt someone else. I don't intend to go off searching for him by myself, but if I see him, how do I deal with him? You call me. She glared at him. I'm not accustomed to relying on a man for anything. That is a pity. I suggest you get accustomed to it, Jody. She rolled her eyes. I don't recall telling you to use my first name. He chuckled in an indulgent fashion, as though she was amusing him. The thing is, once you're all powered up and you fully understand how to use your magic, you could probably deal with someone like him, but right now, your best bet is to call for help if you see him. She squirmed slightly, wondering if he somehow knew she hadn't been studying the book like she was supposed to. Part of it had been simply being busy trying to adjust to her new duties, and part of it was pure reluctance. Delving too deeply into the book and the magic was admitting she had access to it. As it was, she had stifled that knowledge and hadn't used any magic since that day she displayed it for her mother so Willa would believe the truth of the town. How do you deal with him then? I incapacitate him with magic and return him to hell after a simple exorcism. With any luck, Mr. Walton is still alive and safe, though if his body is injured while Stanton is occupying it, Mr. Walton will die as soon as he leaves, assuming it's a grave injury, of course. She frowned. Will he remember any of it? Drake hesitated. It's hard to say. Sometimes, victims remember here and there, but mostly, it seems to be a blank, which is probably a blessing for most of them. Jody could imagine that. If something stole her body and used it to commit horrible acts, she wouldn't want to have any memory of them either. I'll let you know if I see him. You can call me for an update anytime you want. He handed her a business card. She laid it on her desk on top of the picture of Mr. Walton. I'll keep that in mind. In other words, you're too stubborn to call to ask me anything. She fluttered her eyelashes at him. Why would I ever want to call you if I didn't have to, Mr. Abaddon? It's going to be like that, is it? He shook his head, but he laughed. Jody frowned. Like what? He leaned closer, and his scent was enticing for a flash. It left Jody's mouth dry, and she bunched her hands into fists, digging her nails into her palms in a bid to control the urge to reach out and touch him. You know, you're just going to pretend like you don't. He winked at her as he stepped back. It was nice to see you again, Sheriff Shaw. She frowned. I wish I could say the same, Mr. Abaddon. I'll be quite happy if you catch the demon and return to hell with no reason to come back to Harrow Bay. Sure, you will, he said in a knowing fashion, drawing out the words with a hint of heat that was inappropriate. He winked at her again and sauntered out of her office. Jody glared after him, but she couldn't pretend he didn't have a point. She was aware of that sizzle between them, and though she had no intention of getting caught up in anything with one of Hell's bounty hunters, she couldn't deny there was something magnetic about Drake. Not that she had any plans of pursuing the attraction between them. She'd never had much interest in settling down with a man, and that wasn't about to change, particularly for someone like Drake Abaddon. Chapter 8. Isabel. Vil mech huth, said Isabel, drawing out the syllables slowly and carefully, just like the book instructed. The Cheerio she was directing the magic toward wobbled a bit on the table and cracked on one side, but it was hardly the explosion it should have been. Vel mich huth? She tried again, just in case she'd pronounced the invocation incorrectly. The Cheerio didn't even wiggle at that turn of phrase. With a sigh of disgust, she sat back and closed the book she'd found in her granddaughter's room. Isabel knew she wasn't supposed to have it, since it was right there on the front page that it was only for law enforcement and authority figures in the town, but she wasn't going to let a little thing like that stop her. It had a lot of spells she'd never heard of, including binding spells and others meant to incapacitate someone else's magic. They hadn't been the kind of thing she'd been exposed to when she'd lived in Harrow Bay as a teenager, but she didn't think it was lack of exposure that was hindering her ability to perform magic. With a sigh, she pushed away from the table and stood up. It was coming back to her easily now, and she recalled part of the reason she'd had little trouble leaving Harrow Bay to tag along with Andy was because she hadn't been able to tap into the magic herself. Some of her friends had had an innate ability that seemed to manifest itself the older they grew, but it had always been a struggle for Isabel. When she wasn't very good at it, it had seemed like a small thing to give up, and Andy had been such an important part of her life then. Not to mention Willa had been growing in her stomach by the time she left Harrow Bay. She'd hoped age and wisdom would have given her some more aptitude to use magic, but that didn't seem to be the case. She walked back to the book, opening it to another page. This one had a piece of paper tucked in, suggesting Jody go to Amara at the library if she had any trouble. It seemed like a fine idea to Isabel, so she adjusted her compression socks, put on her sensible walking shoes, and left the house a short time later. Willa had confiscated her driver's license a few years ago after the dumpster incident. She'd barely even winged it, but Willa had gotten all bent out of shape about the situation and declared Isabel didn't need to drive anymore. Isabel pretended to go along with it, though there had been times she'd sneaked out of the house and used Willa's car since she came to live with her, but her daughter's car was gone, as was Jody's SUV. Not that she would have been brazen enough to try to steal the sheriff's assigned vehicle. It was a lovely enough day for a walk, and she ignored the slight pain in her hip and knee as she walked the several blocks to the Harrow Bay Public Library. She stopped and stared at it for a moment before entering, deciding it looked much the same as it always had. It was a pale gray brick building in a roughly rectangular shape. The font on the sign was a no-nonsense serif and somehow managed to be nondescript while also being self-evident what it was. She stepped inside, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over her. She'd been somewhat of a bookworm in her younger years, at least until she developed enough for boys to start noticing her. After that, she'd enthusiastically embraced a new aspect of life and left behind books, though she came to love them again in later life. As she ventured into the library, she half expected to find old Mrs. Haskins sitting behind the counter. She'd been a decrepit old hag back when Isabel was still visiting the library, and she'd no doubt died by now unless she was something like a crone, but it was still almost startling to see a young and pretty blonde woman behind the counter instead of the glaring old librarian, who'd seemed to think everyone was out to fold tea. He corners on her books. She walked closer as the blonde noticed her. She had sparkling green eyes and a friendly smile, and there was a soothing essence about her that immediately put Isabel at ease. "Hello, dear," the librarian smiled at her. "Hello, you must be the sheriff's mother." Isabel laughed. "I'm her grandmother, and if you meet Willa, you'll easily be able to tell the difference. I swear my daughter stopped aging years ago. She must know some powerful magic," said Amara with a light laugh. "Not until we moved here anyway." She lowered her voice slightly. "That's sort of why I'm here." "Are you Amara?" The librarian nodded her head as she came out from behind the counter and led Isabel to a table nearby. "What can I do for you? Do you want to know more about the history of the town?" Isabel shook her head. "I lived here years ago. What I want to know is how to use magic more efficiently. I've been looking through my granddaughter's book, but nothing seems to be working for me." Amara's lips parted in a small gasp, and she looked horrified for a moment. "You've been trying to do magic out of the sheriff's book?" Isabel refused to be scolded or feel like a naughty child. "I was just browsing." Amara shook her head. "I'm afraid that book isn't for you, so most of it probably won't work. I mean, you can memorize the spells, but unless you have natural aptitude, you have to delve into the town's magic to really do anything. It probably won't cooperate with you." Isabel couldn't hide her disappointment. "How unfortunate. I really wanted this to work." "Oh, you can still tap into the magic. You can learn other forms, but you won't be able to use the sheriff's magic. It's all slightly different from that meant for a regular citizen. Does that make sense? Isabel shrugged, because it didn't fully make sense to her. It sounded like the town had some way of recognizing who could use what kind of magic. That seemed rather confusing and convoluted to her, but being magic, she supposed there was some order to it, or some way to ease the necessary distinctions. How can I learn magic if it won't work for me? I never had much aptitude for it. Imara seemed to be considering it for a moment before she smiled. You could go talk to Herschel Gant. Who's Herschel Gant? He runs Gant's magic shop, which looks like toys and novelties to the tourists, but as a resident, you can see the true offerings: magical supplies, potions, books, and the works. Hirsch also teaches classes on finding your own inner magic. I think he'll be just the person to help you with your quest, Mrs. Shaw. It's Campbell. Isabel Campbell, but you might as well call me Isabel. Imara smiled as she reached for a piece of paper and a pen displayed neatly on the table in a small organizer. I'm going to write down his address for you, but honestly, you can't miss the shop. It's 2 blocks down and to the left. Walk down Eldridge Street, and you'll see it. It's big and gaudy to bring in the tourists, so I think it's impossible to miss. She passed over the address she had just written. Good luck with your adventure, Isabel. Her eyes sparkled, but her tone still had a faint hint of warning when she added, remember to stay out of Sheriff Shaw's book. If you get anything to work for you, it might not turn out as you'd like anyway, since her magic isn't meant for you. Isabel took the address and mumbled a thank you, feeling slightly disgruntled that she was being warned away from it like a mischievous child. She didn't need a mother or someone to look after her, though young people often assumed she did. She wasn't sure why, but it seemed to come with age that after you reached a certain point, everyone around you just assumed you became an incompetent loon who couldn't make decisions for yourself. She had to admit Jody had never done that to her, and Willa was usually fairly good about respecting her abilities, save for stealing her keys and license a few years ago, but far too many people treated Isabel like she'd somehow lost the ability to be a competent adult along the way. She resented it. She followed Imara's instructions and found Gant's magic shop easily enough. It truly was a gaudy monstrosity from the outside, but as soon as she stepped inside, it felt pleasant and awash with a faint hum of power. It was this awareness she'd attuned to again since returning to Harrow Bay, though it had been gradual. It suddenly felt much more pronounced in here, and she was optimistic once more that she might find a way to utilize magic even if Jody's magic was denied to her. She approached the counter, seeing a chubby, middle-aged man standing behind the cash register. He had a brown beard with a few sprinkles of gray, bushy eyebrows that threatened to invade his forehead and overtake it completely, and dimples in his cheeks when he gave her a sincerely warm smile. He came out from behind the counter and approached her, taking her hand before he said a word. He closed his eyes for a moment, and Isabel felt a soft flare of power wash over her. It wasn't intrusive. Rather, it felt kind and warm. His smile broadened as he stepped back, releasing his hold on her. Welcome to Gant's Magic Shop. I'm Hirsch Gant. How may I help you? I'm Isabel Campbell. I just moved here again after about 60 years away. I never had much aptitude for magic before, so it was easy to walk away. Now that I'm here again, I want to know all about it. I want to learn how to use it. Hirsch looked at her intently for a moment. Why? She frowned, stuttering. Why what? What's your purpose for learning magic? She shrugged, looking for an answer. It's something to do? He looked disappointed as he shook his head. I'm afraid I can't help you if you don't tell me the truth, Mrs. Campbell. It's Ms. She corrected with a bit of heat. It seems like the thing to do. I live in a magical town, so I might as well take full advantage of it. He still seemed exasperated and a little disheartened. I have a sense for people. I can read their auras, so I can tell you aren't being entirely truthful. I need to know your goals so I can know the best way to help you. Isabel contemplated just turning around and walking out. Did she really need all this fuss and bother? Recalling Sally Gilling's way of manipulating everyone and how she ruled the senior center with an iron fist stiffened her spine and strengthened her resolve. Though it sounded petty, she finally admitted the truth. I want to learn enough magic to make Sally Gilling miserable enough so that she learns she's not in total control of the senior center. I don't want to kill her or anything, she added hastily. She had a feeling Mr. Gant would be opposed to murder, and she truly didn't want Sally Gilling to die. She just wanted her to suffer. She wasn't certain what to expect with his reaction, and he blinked a couple of times as though astonished. The massive caterpillars doubling his eyebrows swooped up and down in a hypnotic fashion as he did so. She half expected him to reject her less than noble reasons and send her on her way. That wouldn't stop Isabel, but she knew it would slow her down if she didn't have a mentor to guide her. Instead, he started to grin, and finally, a deep belly laugh escaped him. It was a joyous chuckle, and there was no doubting the genuineness of it. When he regained control, he wiped his eyes and put his hand on Isabel's shoulder. In that case, I think I can help. She frowned, slightly confused. Are you sure? You seem rather wholesome, Mr. Gant. His eyes twinkled. You may call me Hirsch, and I suppose that's a fair assessment, but I don't see anything particularly unwholesome in knocking Sally Gilling down a peg or two. My grandmother is a resident of the same assisted living facility where Sally lives, and she can barely tolerate Sally Gilling. The woman is a tyrant. Isabel grinned, realizing she'd found an ally. Yes, she is. I think it's time someone took her on. I couldn't agree more, Ms. Campbell. He waved a hand. This shop is special. It's not just because I have a talent for helping people find their aptitude for magic. The back room is centered directly on a ley line, and it's one of the more powerful ones. That will help you tap into your magic more easily while you're learning. Once you know how to find it, you won't need the boost of the ley line, but it's certainly helpful for beginners. He walked away from her then, going to the counter and leaning over to retrieve a leather-bound book. He opened it and looked at something. Isabel moved forward, realizing it was the calendar. He looked up. Do you prefer private tutorials, or are you okay with a small group class? Isabel furrowed her brow as she considered it for a moment. I'd rather do one-on-one, at least to start with. I think it will make my education progress faster. He nodded. That's true, but I do recommend you eventually move to smaller classes, since it will give you more opportunity to practice and someone to spar with. Isabel frowned. I'm not planning to duel anyone. Hirsch chuckled, as though he was envisioning her in the midst of a magical duel. I understand that, and I meant by sparring, you could practice with someone, not that you will necessarily be fighting them. I suspect you're taking on Sally in a more covert way. Isabel nodded. Covert enough that she doesn't know what's going on to start with, but not so hidden that she doesn't realize I'm the one making her suffer when the time is right. Ms. Campbell, I think we're going to get along just fine. He penciled in her name and sent her home with a stack of books to study before her first class. Chapter 9. Jody. There was a knock on her door just moments before Jody was planning to leave for the day. She called for the person to enter, and Michael stepped inside. He looked a little uncertain, which wasn't something she'd seen in him before. He seemed to have brash confidence, the kind that came with youth and good looks, and she'd never seen him appear hesitant or uncertain before. Something on your mind, Michael? My mom wants me to invite you to dinner. He looked down, blushing faintly. It was like he'd asked her on a date or something. Jody had to curtail the urge to laugh at his expression and the way he held himself, as though preparing for rejection. That's sweet of your mom, but may I ask why? I think it's more my dad than my mom, to be honest. He probably wants to talk to you about the shifter packs around here, but he wanted it to seem more informal and casual. Michael blushed as he revealed that. I probably shouldn't have said that. Jody couldn't help laughing then. I'd rather you be honest, Michael. Yeah, I can come to dinner. She tried to hide any hint of apprehension at the idea. She couldn't say the thought of being surrounded by a group of wolf shifters felt particularly comforting, or it was something she was anticipating, but there was nothing about Michael to suggest he was scary or dangerous. She hoped his family would be the same way. Great. Dinner's at 7. Jody blinked. Oh, you mean tonight? He frowned. Yeah, I guess. Do you have other plans? Jody had planned to stop by and pick up a takeout pizza before a quick visit to the liquor store to grab a good bottle of wine to go with it. They weren't big plans, and there was no reason she couldn't do that another night. She shrugged as she leaned back in her chair. No, I suppose not. I'll be there at 7 then. Thanks for the invitation, Michael. He blushed a little as he nodded. I'll let Mom know. As soon as he left her office, Jody couldn't help a small smile. Michael was ostensibly an adult, but he seemed so much like a kid to her as she was now. He was 23 to her 43, and since she was old enough to be his mother, maybe that made her feel more maternal toward him. He gave every appearance of being a competent deputy, and until just now, she thought he was full of confidence and swagger just like most men his age. It was endearing to see a different side of him, one that was slightly shy and clearly daunted by inviting his boss to dinner. Jody left the station a few minutes later, bypassing the pizza shop and the liquor store. Instead, she went home and had a shower, dressing in semi-casual clothing before walking through the house. When she entered the kitchen, she found her grandmother poring over a stack of books, and she frowned. "Where are your reading glasses, Gram?" Isabel made a dismissive sound. She didn't bother to look up from her books. With a sigh, Jody went into the living room and retrieved them for her grandmother, bringing them back and holding them out to her. "It isn't good to strain your eyes and pretend like you don't need those." "Only old people need glasses," said Isabel. Jody chuckled. "That's not what you told me when I had them from the ages of 6 to 12. You told me they made me look intelligent, and that they were quite flattering." Isabel still looked grumpy when she met Jody's gaze. "You should know I probably lied about that, dear. As your grandmother, I have to say those kinds of things to build up your confidence." Rather than be offended, Jody just laughed. "It's a good thing my confidence is built up now that you're revealing the truth." She bent down and pressed a kiss to her grandmother's temple, ignoring Isabel's muttering about the sign of affection. "Keep on your glasses and enjoy your books, Gra. M." As she stood up, she caught a faint glimpse of one of the pages, which appeared to have diagrams drawn on it. It looked like magic rituals, and it reminded her she still hadn't really cracked open the book Mayor Carroll had given her. She would get around to it sometime soon, she assured herself as she parted from her grandmother. She was returning to her SUV when her mother's car entered the driveway. She waited for Willa to stop and get out before she walked over to her mother when she realized Willa was struggling to pull a box out of the backseat. She held open the door and helped raise it out. "What's all this?" "My friend Patty, at the craft shop, heard I was interested in learning how to do pottery. She's loaning me a wheel." Jody looked at the small wheel in the cardboard box. "I thought it would be bigger." Willa blushed. "If you must know, this is one of the starter wheels she uses for the children's classes. She said it would give me a feel for how it works, and if I like the clay, I can use her bigger wheel in the shop." "Well, enjoy yourself, Mom." Willa nodded, shifting the box to her hip and bracing it with her arm. "Where are you off to? Do you have a date?" Her mother couldn't hide her excitement at the prospect. Jody shook her head. "No, not at all. Michael's parents invited me for dinner." Willa frowned. "Michael, your deputy?" At Jody's nod, she frowned. "Isn't he a werewolf?" "He uses the term wolf shifter, but I don't know if there's a difference." Willa seemed troubled. "You're going to have dinner with a bunch of werewolves? Are you sure that's a good idea?" Jody started to assure her it was, but she hesitated. Truthfully, she had no idea what to expect, though she doubted the Cross family was inviting her to dinner so they could turn her into the main course. "I'm sure it'll be fine. It sounds like his father wants to talk to me about something." "Be careful, dear. Do you have some of those silver bullets?" Jody blinked. "How did you know there are silver bullets in the armory?" "I didn't, dear. I just assumed you would need silver to kill werewolves." Willa blinked. "I cannot believe we're having this conversation in a serious way. It is somewhat surreal." Jody gave her mom a half hug, stepping back as she realized Willa was precariously holding the box. "I'll be safe, and I do have a clip of silver bullets." She watched her mom enter through the garage with her borrowed child's wheel before turning to get into the SUV. After climbing inside, she backed out of the driveway and was soon navigating through town following the instructions the GPS gave her. She had the address because Michael had texted it to her in the interim, and she arrived at the Cross farm within a half hour. Once she had parked near the house, she faced a dilemma. She did have silver bullets in her clip, but it wasn't strictly necessary for her to wear her duty belt in for dinner, which might come across as an aggressive move for a dinner guest. She didn't want to offend the Crosses, but she also didn't want to be without some kind of defense. Before she could decide whether to take the duty belt from the console where she'd placed it, there was a knock on her window. She jumped in surprise and turned to look, finding a teenage girl with a friendly grin standing there. She took the keys out of the switch and made the decision to leave behind her gun, hoping it wasn't one she would regret as she opened the door and slipped out, closing it behind her before standing before the teenager. The girl was tall and willowy, with silver blonde hair and warm brown eyes ringed with bright blue. She looked somewhat like Michael, at least enough to tell they were related. Jody let out a startled grunt when the young woman embraced her. She extricated herself gently. "Sorry, but I'm not much of a hugger." The GIRL giggled. "Oh, sorry. I totally am. Wolves are kind of naturally affectionate anyway, you know?" As she spoke, her open mouth revealed the sharpness of her canines, which were slightly elongated compared to humans, but not so noticeably that she would have seen the difference if she hadn't been thinking to look for something that stood out. "Hey, ease up," said Michael as he appeared behind his sister. He nodded to Jody. "Sheriff Shaw, this is my little sister, Gabby Cross. She is a right pain. He just doesn't like me because I used to tell on him whenever he played kissy face and stayed out after curfew." Gabby laughed in delight, clearly enjoying the memory. Jody smiled, feeling herself more at ease than she'd expected considering she was technically surrounded by predators. She followed the kids into the house, soon meeting Lorna and David Cross. The family was smaller than she'd anticipated, and Jody realized she'd imagined them having a litter or something. "Dinner's pretty much ready to go," said Lorna as she gestured for everyone to move into the dining room. As they were going, Jody saw an older man coming down the stairs. He was slightly stooped at the shoulders, and his hair was pure white. He had to be somewhere between her mother and grandmother's age, and he looked like he'd aged hard. "Dad, I'm glad you felt like coming down," said David as he walked over, casually putting a hand on the older man's elbow. It was obviously to help support him, but he did it in a way that seemed more like it was an affectionate act than one that emphasized the man's fragility. "I had to meet the new sheriff," said the man in a gruff voice. He had a slight slur, and by the way one of his eyelids drooped, Jody inferred he'd had a stroke. She stepped forward, holding out her hand when he was near. "It's nice to meet you, sir. This is Benjamin, my father," said David. "You're considerably prettier than the last sheriff," said Benjamin with a wink and a chuckle. Jody grinned. "I might see from where Michael gets his flirtatious nature." Michael sounded like he was choking on something, and they hadn't even sat down to eat yet. What? You haven't been inappropriate with the sheriff, have you?" His mom glared at him. "Hardly," said Jody with a smile intended to put his mother at ease. "I just noticed he's quite popular with the young ladies." Lorna seemed sanguine about that. She nodded as they reached the table, with everyone taking a seat before she spoke. "He's always had a way of charming girls around here. Not that he shows any inclination to settle down and have a family." Michael groaned. "Ma, I'm only 23, and way too young to consider that." "I agree," said Jody. "You're far too young. Of course, I think I feel too young to settle down too, and I'm 43. Michael grinned, and Gabby looked intrigued, but Lorna appeared horrified. "You just have to meet the right man, Sheriff Shaw." Jody couldn't help snorting. "I'm pretty sure such a man doesn't exist, at least for me." "You shouldn't let a few failed relationships discourage you from finding love." Lorna spoke with authority. Jody smiled, not intending to delve into her checkered romantic past. She doubted the woman seated across from her could understand why Jody had voluntarily chosen not to get married or have children. Likely, she thought Jody was secretly nursing a broken heart or had been disappointed too many times and had given up on love. In reality, Jody just considered it a minor priority. Food started passing around the table, and Jody's stomach growled when the scent of the rare roast beef hit her. "Everything looks delicious, Mrs. Cross," Lorna corrected his mother. "And thank you. I do enjoy my kitchen time." Jody nodded, though she couldn't really relate to that either. She could handle the basics, but she'd never learned much about cooking or baking, also because of a lack of interest. After everyone had a chance to serve themselves, and small talk circulated for a while, David cleared his throat toward the middle of the meal. "I hope you don't mind, but I asked Michael to invite you here not just to meet you, Sheriff, but to give you a chance to meet us as well." She tilted her head slightly. "I appreciate the invitation." He nodded. "I meant specifically us as a shifter family. I have a feeling you've never dealt with anyone like us before." He stated that like it was a fact. Jody could hardly argue. "I haven't. We thought it might be good for you to know what to expect. For the most part, shifters, regardless of their species, are pretty close to humans. We have similar goals and lifestyles, and cherish the same things: love, family, and happiness." Jody nodded as she dabbed at her mouth with a napkin before returning it to her lap. "That's admirable. So why do I sense a but?" David gave her a half smile. "I suppose there's always a but. Shifters can shift any time, but during the full moon, we have no choice. That's also when we're the most animalistic, so most of us take precautions. We have bunkers or other means of confining ourselves during the night of the full moon and the nights before and after, just to be on the safe side. However, the precautions sometimes fail. That's just a reality, and you might have an escaped wolf shifter or other species from time to time. Even worse, we get drifters sometimes, and they're the ones who don't care about the danger they pose. They make no effort to lock themselves away to protect others. I don't care how you deal with that kind, but I wanted you to know the other side of the rest of us, the ones who live in Harrow Bay, and plan for these contingencies. You'll find enough tranquilizer at the station to knock out 100 wolves, and I hope you'll reach for tranquilizer darts before you reach for bullets if it comes to an escaped werewolf." "Does it have to be silver?" It was kind of an idle question, but it was information she needed to know. David nodded in confirmation. "Only silver can kill us. We've taken precautions, and there's a special cell at the jail that is reinforced enough that you can put an unconscious shifter in there if you happen to run across one that fled during the full moon. Even if they come to before the moon sets and the sun rises, they won't be able to escape the confines. We've had this arrangement worked out for at least 60 years, and I hope you're okay with continuing that." Jody looked at the faces around her, unable to imagine her first instinct would be to shoot one of them if they were out prowling around in wolf form, though she supposed fear might edge out that uncertainty and hesitation if it came down to it. "I'll be sure to stock tranq darts, particularly around the full moons." "I assume they're in all the cars already, Michael?" Michael nodded. "You might not have any in your kit though, Jody. We wanted to explain it all to you and talk to you about it first, but I'll make sure you have some in your SUV tomorrow." Jody nodded her appreciation. "How dangerous are you while shifting?" "Most of us are pretty tame," said Lorna. "We were either born this way, or we've had years to adjust. It's usually the newer ones, or those going through puberty, that really lose control. They can be quite wild and out of touch with their human side during that phase of the moon. Any other time we shift, we're in complete control, but the moon still dominates us." She sounded faintly resentful of that. "So, werewolves can be turned, not just born?" Jody paused to savor a bite of the roast, watching David as she waited for an answer. "Yes. We have an enzyme." Jody nodded. "Like the vampires, I guess?" David nodded. If he was surprised by her knowledge, he didn't show it. "Similar, though not the same, obviously. Someone might survive a wolf bite without shifting or becoming a shifter, but the more extensive the attack and exposure to saliva, the more likely they are to be turned. We try to keep our population strictly controlled, and none of us would turn someone who didn't want to be turned, But in the throes of moon lust, we can't always control what we do. Even the most grounded and experienced of us can sometimes lose control. Benjamin winced, and Jody couldn't help noticing it. She looked at him, and obviously the question must be in her eyes, though she didn't utter it. "He's talking about me," said Benjamin with that faint slur. "I got out a couple years back. Hadn't been out in years during the turn of the moon, and I attacked some campers. They shot me in the head, which was the only choice they had to defend themselves. Fortunately for me, it wasn't a silver bullet, but it sure did enough damage." Jody realized what she'd thought had been brought on by a stroke must have been traumatic brain injury from the gunshot instead. "Don't you have some kind of super healing ability?" Lorna snorted. "I wish. It doesn't work like that. That's one of those old wives' tales I wish were in our favor, but the truth is, it takes us almost as long to heal as it does a human. Sometimes, you can get injured to the point you can't heal, though only silver can kill you. It's kind of a miserable existence, I'm sure." Benjamin self-consciously touched his forehead. "This is no picnic, but I have it easy compared to some." He looked at Jody, his blue eyes watery, though it was difficult to tell if that was from age or from emotion. "I never intended to hurt anyone, and that's the thing about it. Most of us are horrified after we've done something like that, but we also understand we have to be stopped. If we can't stop ourselves, it's your job to do it. If the tranks don't work, you have to be ready to use the silver." Jody shot a glance at David and Lorna. David looked faintly troubled, but Lorna was nodding her agreement. Jody slowly nodded too. "I think I understand what you're trying to tell me, Mr. Cross. Otherwise, you won't find much trouble from us, except maybe Gabby," said Lorna with a faint look of censure toward her daughter. Jody frowned as she looked at the blonde teenager. "You don't really strike me as the troublemaking type, Gabby." Gabby giggled. "Mom's just irritated because I got a speeding ticket last week. And you got into trouble for skipping class the week before," said David with a harsh frown. "That's not to be taken lightly either, young lady. I was helping my friends, and you know the story." Whatever it was, Gabby appeared to think it was justified, and there was no further argument from her parents. They obviously didn't plan to reveal the whole incident to Jody, and it wasn't her business, so she was fine with that. They spent the rest of the evening in enjoyable conversation, rarely touching on the topic of shifters. Jody left more than an hour later, with her stomach pleasantly full, and mostly reassured about the shifters living in town. She was glad to have a couple of weeks until her first full moon in Harrow Bay, and she was dreading it slightly, but it sounded like most of the shifters in town had a pretty smooth process to keep themselves and everyone else around them safe. Chapter 10. Willa. Willa marched into Patty's shop the next afternoon, dropping the box with the wheel onto a bench table. "It's a disaster. A complete disaster, Patty." Her friend looked up from what she'd been doing behind the counter and grinned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I couldn't get the clay to do anything besides fly all over my garage. I tried wetting my fingers, and I tried a soft touch. Then I tried a hard touch. It looks like an archaeological dig in the garage now." With a chuckle, Patty came out from behind the counter. "Why don't we work on the big wheel, and you can try it again?" Willa wasn't convinced that was a good idea. After her brief experience with trying to control the clay this morning, she was prepared to wash her hands of the whole hobby, but Patty was so compelling that it was difficult to refuse. She followed her friend to the corner, where there was a small configuration of wheels. This must be where Patty taught one of her classes. Patty sat her down in front of one and put a lump of wet clay on the wheel. She sat beside Willa, putting her hand over one of Willa's. "Just curve your hand lightly to the clay. Make sure you keep your fingers damp, and if you need to, there's a sponge in a bowl of water beside you that you can use to dampen it." As she spoke, Patty pressed the foot pedal, and the wheel started to turn slowly. "It also helps if you control the speed. That's not a possibility with the kids' wheels that I loaned you, but this one is top of the line." Willa wasn't certain how she felt about this. The clay was squishy in her hand, and there was a strange tingling where Patty was touching her. She wondered if she was allergic to something in the clay, but she brought up her other hand in a bid to follow Patty's instructions. With Patty's help, which meant Patty guided her hands and held them to shape the pot, she soon had a modest little vase that was no more than 6 inches but had an indentation and only one warped side. Patty stopped turning the wheel and released her hold on Willa's hands. Willa's fingers were still tingling, and she chalked it up to the clay as she looked at the small vase. "It's nice, but I don't think it's for me." "There's no shame in that." With a casual movement, Willa picked up the clay vase they had just created and chucked into an open plastic trash can filled with other remnants of clay. "We'll just recycle it for another class. There must be a different craft you'll like though. How's your crochet coming along?" Willa flushed. "Not very well. Did you bring it with you?" Patty gave her an encouraging smile. Willa reluctantly nodded as she stood up, following Patty over to the deep sink in the corner where they washed their hands of the clay before returning to the table where she'd left her purse. She pulled out the scarf she had started, holding it up for Patty's scrutiny. It was impossible to miss how the rows were uneven, and rather than straight sides, it seemed almost like a scalloped edge, though not in an even enough way to pretend it had been something deliberate. Patty's lips twitched, and she compressed them together for a moment before she said, "Oh, my." "Exactly." Willa shook her head. "I just don't think I have the talent for this sort of thing." She didn't mention her needlepoint, which was the only craft she was somewhat confident about doing. "Well, don't give up yet. There's knitting, and I'm teaching a painting class this afternoon. Why don't you sit in on that? I have another new student who signed up a couple of weeks ago, and it should be quite fun." Willa wasn't certain she would be any better at painting or knitting than she was at the other things she'd tried so far, but she found herself wanting to linger. She liked spending time with Patty and sticking around or the class gave her a good excuse. Patty put her to work, helping organize items in the store as they chattered away. Before she knew it, a couple of hours had passed, and the bell on the door jingled as a man around their age entered. He was balding and had a faint paunch, and his features were nothing special, so Willa barely looked at him to start with. It was only when they were seated with canvases in front of them as Patty walked them through an introduction to watercolors that she really noticed him. He was looking at her in an almost appraising fashion, and there was clear admiration in his gaze. She flushed underneath the intensity of it, quickly averting her gaze. "What brings you here, miss?" He had a deep and soothing voice. Patty thought I might like it. He smiled. "I signed up for this class a while back. Circumstances changed recently, but I decided why not. I've never done anything like this before. Maybe it will be as entertaining as my previous hobby." He chuckled, and it had a strange edge to it, but when Willa looked at him, he was just smiling at her. "I'm having trouble finding a hobby that suits me as well." He nodded, looking understanding. "My last one just didn't work out. It was too dangerous." "Was it glassblowing?" asked Patty, still dabbing at her canvas, but clearly participating in the conversation. "It was something like that." Patty led them through the rest of the class, teaching about perspective as they painted a street lined with dots of light. Patty made it look easy and effortless, and her class companion had a passably good painting by the time they concluded, but Willa was despondent about hers. It looked like something Jody would have painted with her fingers when she was 4 or 5. She sighed as she set down the brush. "I don't believe this is for me either, Patty. It's not that bad, but we'll keep trying if you want to attempt a different hobby." "Are you new in town?" asked the man who'd introduced himself as James. Willa nodded. "We just moved here a short time ago. My daughter's the new sheriff." She couldn't hide the pride that bled through her tone as she told him that. She knew how hard Jody had worked to get there, and she was proud of her daughter. "I'm a recent arrival myself, Willa. Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Willa was startled by the invitation. She hadn't been out on a date since before Elton passed away. He had been too sick toward the end to go anywhere, and she'd just assumed that part of her life was over. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Patty nudged her on the shoulder as she said, "I think that would be fun for you, Willa. You need to get out there." Willa frowned at her friend, but she couldn't think of a gracious way to get out of the invitation now. As James looked at her expectantly, His bland face contorted into an expression of hopeful anticipation. She found she couldn't deny the request anyway. She nodded slowly. That might be nice. I haven't been on a date in years. James smiled. I haven't either. It's been such a long time. He sighed. Maybe it's time to try again. He looked at Patty then. Of course, you're welcome to join us if you want to, Patty. Patty chuckled. No, I don't fancy being the fifth wheel, but I do thank you for the kind invitation, James. You two kids have fun. She waved a hand. Don't worry about cleaning up. That's included in the price of the class. Willa was uncertain she was making the right decision, but she was also kind of excited about the idea of going on a date again, though James wasn't particularly thrilling. Willa looked at her canvas before looking at Patty. Can you recycle this? I can put on a few layers of gesso and reuse it. Are you sure you don't want to keep it? Willa laughed. I'm sure. Jody would probably hang it on the fridge like I used to do or her kindergarten artwork. Patty chuckled, and James laughed a little as well. Willa was just being honest, and she wasn't used to making people laugh. There was something to be said for it, and James seemed more interesting when he smiled. She had what she hoped were well-managed expectations and hopes for the date ahead of her that evening. When she got home a short time later, she found her mother preparing to make dinner. She felt awkward when she said, "Don't worry about cooking for me. I'm having dinner out tonight." "Are you going out with Patty?" asked Isabel. Willa shook her head, feeling a fluttering sensation in her stomach at the idea. "I would hardly go on a date with Patty." Isabel turned away from the stove. "You have a date?" Her mother sounded shocked. Willa felt a little sour about that, and her sourness doubled when Jody entered the room then. "Did I hear you have a date, Mom?" She sounded equally stunned. Willa glared at her mother and then her daughter. It has been known to happen in the history of the world that sometimes a 60-something widow is asked out on a date, you know. "Sure, but usually not you," said Isabel. Willa glared at her mother. "Thanks, Mother." Isabel waved a hand. "I don't mean it like that, dear. You're still quite an attractive woman. I just didn't know you were ready to put yourself out there again. You still seem wrapped up with Elton as part of your identity." Willa frowned, feeling defensive. "I was married to him for 43 years. It's natural he would be a big part of my identity. I'm not saying it isn't, honey." Isabel was speaking in a soothing fashion now, clearly realizing she was riling Willa and trying to avoid that. Willa was surprised to find she was getting angry. Usually, she could endure her mother's words and criticisms with grace. It's just a date with another person who's lonely and new to town as well. James is quite a nice guy, or at least he seems to be. It's just one little dinner. I hope it turns out to be more for you. Jody came over and hugged her. "I'm sorry, but I have to run back to the station. I just realized I forgot to fill out a report." She let out a weary sigh, and Willa gave her a sympathetic look. She knew how much her daughter hated dealing with the paperwork that came with her job. "You'll be back in time for dinner?" asked Isabel to Jody. Jody nodded. "It shouldn't take me more than an hour. I should have known I was escaping way too early." With another sigh that sounded like the world rested on her shoulders, she waved at both of them and departed through the door Willa had just entered through a few minutes before. "Do you have everything you need for a date, dear?" Willa frowned at her mom. "I'm not sure what I'd need for a date besides clothes, money, and an appetite." "I meant, do you have protection?" Willa shook her head. "What do you mean?" "I don't think he's dangerous." Her mother sighed with obvious exasperation as she sent her a meaningful look. "I mean protection, dear." Willa frowned, about to open her mouth to protest she still didn't understand, but she realized her mom was talking about prophylactics. "Good Lord, Mother. Of course, I don't have that. That's very irresponsible of you, dear." Willa blinked. "First of all, I've been through menopause. I'm not getting pregnant anytime soon, I assure you." Her mother turned away from the skillet she'd been stirring with her hands on her hips. She frowned in obvious disapproval. "Your age group is the fastest growing demographic for STDs, dear. It's because you all think you're at no risk of getting anything these days. You can't get pregnant, but you can still get a disease. Bring a condom. You don't want to end up in a situation where you want one and don't have it. I mean, I was with this lovely man, Artie, recently. If I hadn't been prepared, nothing would have happened, because he was astonished at the idea of having to use a condom at his age. Isabel clicked her tongue, expressing her dissatisfaction. Willa had to resist the childish urge to clap her hands over her ears and scream la 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 to drown out her mother's words. I'm not sleeping with someone on the first date, Mother, and for the love of everything holy, please never, ever tell me about your personal life again. I don't want to know any part of it. You have always been such a prude, said Isabel with a shake of her head and a soft exhale. I just don't understand it. I tried to raise you better than that. Maybe I rebelled against your free love lifestyle, Mother. Isabel shrugged. Maybe so, but that's definitely your loss, Willa. Now go get dressed for your date and be prepared to have a good time. Be prepared, she said with special emphasis again. With a cry of disgust, Willa shook her head and turned away from her mother, exiting the kitchen to head upstairs so she could prepare for her date. She would take care of her appearance, but she had absolutely no intention of taking along a condom. She couldn't imagine sleeping with James at any point in her life, let alone on the first date. She had made Elton work for it, and they had been engaged and just weeks from getting married before she'd finally capitulated all those years ago. She certainly wasn't about to open her legs for a man she'd just met on the first date. She was nothing like her mother when it came to that. Chapter 11. Jody. When she got back to the station to fill out the report, Jody was surprised to find Drake waiting for her. As she unlocked the door to let herself in, she traded a pleasant enough greeting with him as she asked, "What brings you by so late?" "There have been a couple of sightings around Harrow Bay. I think Stanton is in the area, since a few people have recognized his vessel. I just wanted to stop by and see if you've had any luck." Reluctantly, she held the door open for him to enter first before following him in. She couldn't really explain why, but she didn't want to have him inside the station. She didn't like having him too close. It made her feel itchy and simultaneously confined, like her skin had shrunk to be a size too tight. It was a peculiar reaction, and she didn't enjoy it. Instead of leading him into her office and offering a seat, she leaned against Tara's desk. "There's been nothing new." He looked frazzled. "Damn. I'd hoped you would have better news." She arched her brow at his tone. "I'm not the bounty hunter from hell. Isn't it your job to catch these fiends?" He glared at her. "Are you saying I'm not good at my job?" Jody shrugged a shoulder. "It's awfully hard to tell, since I haven't seen you do it yet." His eyes narrowed at her overly sweet tone, and he clearly didn't like what she inferred. He seemed to be clenching his jaw, so his words came out slightly compressed. "I'm one of the best." Jody tipped her head slightly as she appraised him. "Maybe your boss should consider getting some new help." He scowled at her. "Are you volunteering?" She grimaced. "Not hardly. I have no intention of going to hell when I die." "I'm sure no one wants to go," he said with a hint of dryness. She looked at him again. "So, what did you do to get sent there, since only the bad people go?" He scowled at her. "I wasn't sent to hell, and I'm not dead. My father was a demon, remember? Lucky me, I inherited the family business. You don't have to be dead to enter hell." Jody shifted slightly, uncertain why she felt a hint of relief at learning he was still alive. She hastily assured herself it was simply because he wasn't evil enough to have done something to consign himself to hell. "I'll keep an eye out for this Stanton guy, just like I said I would, but there hasn't been anything much going on here, except for a feral vampire attack." Surprisingly, he looked sympathetic. "I heard about that." It made her uneasy, and she glared at him. "Do you have spies in my town?" He let out a harsh laugh, but he seemed genuinely amused. "Why would I need spies in a town like Harrow Bay? It's a small town, and people like to talk. Gossip travels faster than herpes around here." Jody's eyes widened at the analogy. "Is that a big problem in Harrow Bay?" He frowned. "I think gossip is a big problem in any small town." In spite of herself, she chuckled. "I meant herpes. Is that a big problem in Harrow Bay?" He looked thrown off kilter for a moment. It's just a saying. I have no idea. All the more reason to be discerning. She stood up then, looking pointedly at the door. If there's nothing else, I have things I must do. His eyes narrowed. Yeah, because Harrow Bay is such a hotbed of activity of late. She bristled at his mocking tone as she gestured toward the door. I promised Graham I'd be home for dinner. You know the way out. He nodded. I do, but I'm sure I'll be back soon. He glanced out the window. I can hardly wait, she said in a tone dripping with sarcasm. He ignored her contribution, seeming to be mostly talking to himself. I think I have enough light left to check out a possible sighting about 45 miles south of here. As he waved at her and sauntered out, the funny thing was, she wasn't entirely lying about wanting to see him again. Something about Drake unsettled her, but she couldn't deny she enjoyed their exchanges, and she was mildly intrigued by him, to say the least. Not that she had any intention of exploring that. She did her best to set him from her mind as she walked down the hall to her office. She was finishing off the report she'd overlooked earlier when she heard a voice from the main room. She got to her feet and eased cautiously out of her office. People love us on TikTok, said Bees, his voice full of pride as he talked to himself. With a frown, Jody marched closer, ignoring Bees's attempt to stand between her and the monitor when he caught sight of her. She bent to investigate what he was talking about. She wasn't overly familiar with TikTok, but she could certainly recognize an account, particularly when it claimed to be the official account of the Harrow Bay Police Department. Her eyes widened when she saw the number of followers, and she scrolled down a little bit to the most recent video Bees had posted. It already had several 100,000 views, followed with comments that were from admiring to amusing, along with an occasional outright accusation of lying. She shook her head as she glared at him. I told you to shut all this down. I can't, Sheriff Shaw. Do you know how long it's taken to get this kind of following? If I just walk away, it leaves tons of people without any further information. Jody couldn't keep the exasperation from her tone. That's the point, Bees. People outside Harrow Bay don't need to know the secrets of the town. You're putting lives at risk. He glared at her. I am not. No one even believes. She rolled her eyes. From some of those comments I viewed, it seems like at least a few believe. He shook his head, looking earnest. They want to believe, but they're just pretending. To them, it's all good fun. Jody rubbed the bridge of her nose. So, what do you get out of it, Bees? He shuffled awkwardly on the desk, avoiding looking at her. It's fun. She scowled, finding it difficult to believe that was his sole reason for all this. There has to be something more involved. He shrugged a shoulder. I like entertaining people. Your days of entertaining are over. I'm shutting down everything, and I want you out of the sheriff's station. You no longer live here. She glared down at the little red demon, suppressing a surge of guilt when he looked temporarily devastated. You can't, Sheriff Shaw. This is my life. He seemed on the verge of tears. For a moment, she considered relenting, but a glance at the counter revealed the views of the video had already jumped a few hundred more in the space of their conversation, and she couldn't see the wisdom or advisability of allowing information about Harrow Bay into the outside world. I've already decided. There's no point arguing about it. Get your stuff and get out, and make sure you leave all the passwords so I can shut this down. As she finished speaking, she looked up in time to see Aoife standing in the hallway, observing the exchange. She didn't like the pity in Aoife's expression, nor the way it edged toward judgmental when she met her gaze. I didn't expect anyone else to be here, besides Bees, since he's almost always here. She gestured toward her desk. I forgot my purse earlier. She didn't miss the pointed way Aoife had referenced Bees living there. Without another word to them, she turned and walked back to her office. Jody sat down behind the desk and put her fingers on the keyboard to finish her report, though she couldn't focus. She drummed her fingers impatiently on the desk, not at all surprised when there was a tentative knock at her door moments later. Come in, she said, making no attempt to hide her exasperation. Aoife cautiously poked in her head. Do you have a minute, Sheriff? She gestured to the chair in front of her desk. I can spare a few minutes. Aoife sat down, looking uncertain for a moment. I think maybe you were too hard on bees. Jody grimaced. Or not hard enough. What he's doing is stupid and reckless. It's just a bit of fun, and I don't think anyone really takes it seriously. Besides, she trailed off with a sigh. I was just hoping maybe you would reconsider. He's lived here for as long as I've worked here, and of course, he's been here way longer than any of us have been alive. This is his home, Sheriff Shaw. Then he shouldn't have mistreated the privilege. I'm sorry to be so hard about it, Aoife, but I don't think he belongs here, and his videos could stir up trouble for everyone in Harrow Bay. Aoife seemed like she might continue to argue, but she finally just nodded her head. I can see I can't change your mind. I need to get home. She sounded a little aloof as she held up her purse. Jody hated to put some distance between them and make Aoife second-guess her, but she thought she was doing the right thing. It made her uneasy enough to have a little demon living in the sheriff's station anyway, and with him posing a blatant threat to the town they were supposed to be taking care of, she was borderline annoyed that Aoife would question her judgment on the matter anyway. Their first duty was to protect the town and its people, not the demon, no matter how long he'd lived there. Chapter 12. Jody. When she finished the report, Jody headed home without seeing bees. She even checked the supply room, but there hadn't been any sign of him. She dared hope he'd taken her eviction gracefully, though she doubted it. When she dragged herself inside, she was surprised to see her grandmother sitting on the couch with an open box of pizza in front of her. What happened to cooking dinner, and how did you get that past Mom? She leaned closer to pick up a piece, finding it piping hot and covered with pepperoni, sausage, jalapenos, and chorizo. How did you get her to agree to these toppings too? I decided not to bother cooking. And I'm a grown woman, said her grandmother in a firm tone. I know what this does to me, and if I'm prepared to accept the consequences of farts that knock out the cat, it's not Willa's business or yours. Jody almost choked on the bite she was swallowing, but she managed to get it down. We don't have a cat, she said mildly. Then maybe we'll get one. I'm just saying, I don't need someone else's permission to order my dinner. Of course you don't, but I'm just surprised Mom didn't say anything. Jody trailed off as her memory sparked, having temporarily forgotten after the encounter with Drake followed by the argument with bees and rounded out with Aoife trying to guilt her into changing her mind. Oh, that's right, Mom's date. Did you order this before or after she left? Isabel was clearly reluctant to part with the answer, but she finally said, after, in a grudging tone. Jody grinned, but she made no further comment as she finished the bite of pizza in her mouth. How was the guy? Isabel shrugged. I don't know. We hardly met, but he seemed nice enough, though your mother was startled when he showed up here. She reminded him they were supposed to meet at the restaurant, and he told her he'd figured out where she lived by gossip. He seemed to disregard her opinions and valid fears about him showing up, though he wasn't insufferable. Maybe he's not irredeemable, but he's a bit old-fashioned for my tastes. What do you mean? Jody took another bite. Oh, he insisted on opening the door for her and helping her with her jacket, and there was just a manner about him that suggested he might have grown up a couple hundred years ago instead of in the modern world. Willa, being the traditionalist she is, probably likes that sort of thing. Me, I find it stifling. Jody shook her head, not replying until she finished swallowing. I think there's room for both. A man can treat you as an equal and still be respectful or kind by opening your door and having good manners. Isabel waved a hand. You're entitled to your opinion, dear. In other words, her grandmother completely disagreed. He was just rather over the top with it, I guess. It seemed to bother him that your mother insisted on taking her own car. Oh, he even brought her a bouquet of freshly picked flowers and had one in his lapel. Who in the world does that in this day and age? It sounds rather sweet. Jody trailed off, frowning suddenly. It did sound a little odd, and coupled with her grandmother's other comments, it sent a prickle of unease through her. It took her a moment to identify why, and she stood up to search through her pockets. It isn't here. She must have left it back at the station. What's not here? Asked Isabel before she took another bite of the illicit pizza. I wanted to show you a picture. Can you describe the man who picked up Mom? Isabel looked surprised. Why do you care? Just humor me, Graham. After a moment, Isabel set down her pizza straight into the box, since she hadn't bothered with plates, wiped her hands on a napkin, and said, he was pretty average really. Average height, average weight, except for maybe a little soft around the middle, a balding head, and a pair of glasses. That was such a nondescript description, but it could definitely fit the parameters of Mr. Walton's appearance. It was nerve-wracking enough for her to decide she had to call her mother and warn her. I need to go back to the station to retrieve something, but if Mom comes back early with him, try not to let him in again. Why ever not? Isabel sounded cranky. If you don't want your mother to have a personal life, you tell her. Jody shuddered. It has nothing to do with her personal life. I'm concerned the guy who asked her out might not be who we think he is. I don't think he's anything besides bland toast, said Isabel with a firm nod. If I send you a picture, do you know how to open it on your phone? She was envisioning snapping a quick picture of the image Drake had given her when she reached the office. Isabel gave her look full of exasperation. Of course, I know how to download an image. I have a little trouble seeing sometimes, but I'm not stupid. Jody softened her tone. Obviously, you aren't, and I don't want you to think I meant it that way. I just wanted to be sure you know how to use the technology. I'm going to send you a picture of someone, and I need to know if it's the guy who picked up Mom, okay? Isabel reached for her phone. Go ahead. That's why I have to go back to the station. She sighed at having overlooked the image and not having paid much attention to it when he'd brought it by earlier in the week. She'd placed it on the corner of her desk and relegated the whole situation mostly to Drake's purview and out of her territory. Even talking to him earlier hadn't prompted her to bring the photo with her, since she'd never expected to need it. She left the house less than a minute later, rushing to the SUV and soon arriving back at the sheriff's station for the third time that day. On the way, she dialed her mom's phone, and as she was pulling into the station lot, Willa finally answered her phone. Mom, are you all right? Willa sounded surprised. I'm fine. Is something wrong, Jody? You sound odd. This is going to sound crazy, but I want you to end your date. Can you meet me at the sheriff's station? Or are you closer to the house? I'm nearer the sheriff's station. I'll be there shortly, dear. At least her mother didn't sound put out about finishing her date early. Jody left the SUV and went into the office, soon finding the picture Drake had given her, along with his card that had his cell number. She snapped a picture of the picture and texted it to her grandmother before calling Drake. I might have a lead on your Stanton guy. Really? Where? As quickly as possible, Jody explained the situation. While she was still talking to Drake, her phone beeped to indicate she had a text message. Hold on. She pulled the phone away from her ear and opened the text message, getting a 2-word message from her grandmother. That's him. She brought the phone back to her ear. Yeah, it's him. My mother's en route to the sheriff's station right now, but she was out on a date with your demon serial killer. She shivered at the thought. I'll meet you at the sheriff's station as soon as I can. I'm some distance away though. Try to hurry. I'd like to have this guy out of our town as soon as possible, Drake. I will, and take care of yourself, Jody. He sounded genuinely concerned for her. She was too concerned for her mother to worry about herself. Likely, her mother had invented a poor excuse to escape the date, and Stanton might have already realized they were onto him. If that were the case, maybe he'd flee as far as the boundary of Luke's magic would let him. That was a concerning possibility, because she'd rather he be caught and returned to hell that very night. Jody aced in front of the sheriff's station after walking outside again to wait for her mom. She finally breathed a sigh of relief when Willa's Toyota pulled into the parking lot beside her SUV. As her mother shut off the engine, Jody rushed out to her and brought her into the sheriff's station, locking the door. She hugged her mom and then hugged her again. Willa looked surprised when she pulled back. What in the world has gotten into you, Jody? I'm just glad you're okay. About your date, it was no problem it ended early. The man was as boring as can be, but you can't just call and ask me to end my dates in future, Jody. You might not be ready to see me date again after losing your father, and maybe I'm not ready for it either, but I refuse to cater to my adult daughter's whims. She broke off abruptly when Jody hugged her once more. What has gotten into you, girl? Jody finally managed to ease back. I'm sorry. The guy you were out with isn't who you think he is. She frowned. He's not James Walton, a sensible insurance salesman? Willa laughed, clearly disbelieving Jody's words. He certainly does a good job of playing one on TV. I think you're looking for intrigue where none exists, probably because of Harrow Bay's reputation. There's something peculiar about this town, but it seems relatively peaceful and quiet. The vessel's name is James Walton, but he was commandeered by a serial killer from hell in an act of demonic possession, Mom. Jody spoke briskly and quickly, hoping to bypass her mother's shock. A few minutes later, she held her mother's hand while Willa finally returned to consciousness after fainting into the chair behind her, realizing she probably could have handled that better. Are you with me now, Mom? Willa's eyes fluttered open, but her coloring was still pale. What did you say? I asked if you were all right? Willa seemed impatient when she shook her head. Not that. Before I passed out. Did you tell me he was a demon? Jody reluctantly nodded, figuring it was better that her mother knew the truth. Yeah, but I should have found a better way to tell you. Willa blinked as the color slowly returned to her cheeks. Would you believe it's still not the worst date I've ever been on? It was a feeble joke, but she managed what appeared to be a genuine smile. Jody forced a smile, though she wasn't quite ready to be amused by the situation yet. I want you to go home and make sure the doors are locked and that you and Graham are safe. One of Hell's bounty hunters is coming to help me track down the demon. Once he's returned to Hell, the danger will be over. Willa was looking pale again, and sweat beaded her brow. Darling, I really wish you would stop oversharing the details with me. I'm just starting to adjust to the idea that I was on a date with a demon wearing an insurance salesman as a disguise. I really don't need to know who else you're consorting with, or how you're going to handle this. Just tell me when it's over so I can go back to pretending like nothing strange is happening in Harrow Bay. I'm not sure that's the best way to move forward, Mom. Willa straightened her shoulders. It's the way I've decided on, young lady, so feel free to keep me in the dark as much as possible. Jody thought about arguing, but she ended up capitulating with a sigh. Sure, Mom. I'm going to walk you out to your car now, okay? She glanced at her watch, wondering how much longer Drake would be. Twilight was fast approaching. She hated to admit it, but she was looking forward to seeing him. This was certainly his area of expertise, where she felt like a fumbling novice. This wasn't like pulling over her first traffic stop. If she screwed up, she wasn't certain what kind of consequences could be unleashed on the town or herself. She would feel better with Drake beside her, in a strictly professional capacity, of course. Once Willa seemed settled and steady enough to walk, Jody escorted her from the station. She had her hand on her duty belt, but there didn't seem to be any movement. She walked her mother to the Toyota, waiting while Willa disengaged the lock with the fob and entered. Jody glanced in the backseat herself to confirm there was no one else in the vehicle, and she waited again until Willa had turned it on and locked the doors before pulling away. She wished she could take the time to directly escort her mom home, but she was afraid she'd miss Drake if she did that. She was anxious to have Stanton taken back to Hell where he belonged, and the matter resolved. At least until the next escapee. Would dealing with fugitives from Hell ever start to feel routine? She certainly hoped not. She turned and walked back into the station, wondering if she should call Drake again to get an ETA for his arrival. She was thinking about that, but it wasn't enough to dull her usual senses, which were sharper and more sensitively trained due to her line of work. She was aware of something moving behind her, but she didn't turn in time to stop an object from colliding with the back of her head and sending her faceplanting onto the floor. The flare of pain in her nose was the last bit of awareness she maintained until her vision went black. Chapter 13. Jody, Jody's head was pounding fiercely when she woke, but there was no confusion about the situation. She instantly remembered something hitting her in the back of the head, and she wasn't at all surprised to see Harold Stanton wearing James Walton standing in front of her. He loomed over her, but not because of his superior height. Walton wasn't overly tall, by any means. Stanton had taken advantage of her unconscious state to tie her to a chair. She looked down at the zip ties he'd used, relieved he hadn't gone for the handcuffs she carried. Though she wasn't entirely confident she could escape zip ties either, at least it gave her the illusion of having a better chance. He was glaring at her. "It's about time you woke up. Why did you interrupt my date with that perfectly lovely Willa?" "I was saving her from terminal boredom," said Jody with a little snark. He glowered as he came closer. "What a mouth on you. In my day, women knew their place and when to speak, and it certainly was not of turn." Willa seemed like the perfect type. "Who are you?" "I'm the sheriff, and I'm Willa's daughter." He grimaced. "You can't be allowed to meddle. All I want is to find a nice woman and settle down. Until you get the homicidal urge to kill her like you did all your other victims." He looked wounded. "Such terrible manners to mention my past. I thought it was even worse manners to go around killing people, but what do I know?" Her sassy retort earned her a backhand to the face, and Jody winced as pain flared in her cheekbone. "I've been in hell quite a long time, Miss Shaw. I'm never going back, and the only way to do that is to change things. This Walton man is a quiet sort, and I've already stepped into his life with ease. No one even noticed a thing different about him, because he's bland. Your mother's my chance to start over. Newsflash for you. Even if I hadn't called, my mom has no interest in starting anything with you, Stanton. She thought you were boring." His jaw clenched. "I'm not boring. I'm trying to settle down. She's not going to settle for you either way." He looked disgruntled for a moment, but then he seemed to regain his confidence. "I'm certain I can persuade her. But I do need you out of the way. I'm not going to indulge your spoiled behavior, and I want Willa's attention all to myself." It hovered on the tip of Jody's tongue to point out Willa had other people in her life, but she held back. If he killed her, she didn't want him going on a murderous rampage to kill the other people who were part of Willa's life before he decided to take her mother. He didn't seem like the type who was big on accepting the word no. "How did you get out of hell?" As she asked, she subtly tugged at the bonds confining her to the chair. "There are some people in hell who have a special knowledge of the gates. If you get in good with them, they can show you the way out. It took me almost a century to find the right connections and convince the agent to show me the nearest exit. Why would you want to leave hell? I'd think it would be perfect for a guy like you. Aren't you surrounded by despair and murderers?" He frowned. "It's not nearly as much fun to be the one subjected to pain, Miss Shaw. I've endured my victims' deaths many times over in the last 100+ years, and I feel like I've more than paid for my crimes. I'm ready to put it all behind me and start over. Unfortunately, you're a loose end I have to tie up." While he sounded regretful, he didn't look entirely convincing about that. In fact, he seemed rather excited about the idea of having another murder to commit, and clearly, being forced to relive what he'd done to his victims over and over hadn't been enough to dissuade him or remove all his homicidal tending. IES. What's hell like? Jody didn't care, since she had no intention of ever visiting, let alone staying for a while, but she was hoping to buy a little time. "It's what you make of it." With those cryptic words, he started to look around. "You have some fun toys here, but nothing that offers a true challenge. If you'll excuse me, my dear, I need to find something I can really work with. After all, you'll be the last murder I'll commit for quite a long time, or perhaps even forever. Once Walton's shell gives out, I'll have to find a new host, but that won't be for years and years." His voice was growing distant as he walked away from her, still speaking to her while moving through the station. "Sheriff," came a soft voice. She looked over to the left from where she'd heard it, and then looked down when the voice repeated the word. Her eyes widened at the sight of Bees, who was cowering under Michael's desk. She frowned at him. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," he said with a hint of sullenness in his tone, even as he scurried toward her. It didn't seem like the best time to argue the point with him, since she was dependent on him to free her if she definitely wanted to get out of the zip ties. She was still and silent as he extended one of his clawed fingers and easily cut through the plastic keeping her bound to the chair. He did the same on her other arm and then went to work on her feet. Jody had just gotten out of the chair when Stanton returned with a strange assortment of objects in his arms. It looked like he'd raided the evidence locker, the supply room, and from somewhere, he'd also dug up a fidget spinner. She couldn't imagine how he planned to use that to torture her, unless he was going to make her play with it for hours. At the sight of her free, he stumbled to a halt and dropped the things in his arms. "What are you doing out of that chair?" He shook his finger at her as he strode forward. You're a very naughty girl, Miss Shaw. I'm not a girl, I'm a woman, and I'm the sheriff of Harrow Bay. As she spoke, Jody reached for her duty belt, though she wasn't at all surprised to find her gun was missing. Her taser was gone too, as was her nightstick. She was planning to improvise when Bees darted forward. He tripped Stanton, causing him to crash to the ground. Then he placed his hand on Stanton's head, and the man appeared to be immobilized. He looked up at Jody in a challenging way. I can knock him out for you, but we need to come to an agreement first. She glared down at the little demon. Now's not the time to negotiate, Bees. Put him out so Drake can deal with him. The demon shook his head. No, I want you to admit first this is my home, and you aren't going to send me on my way. I've lived here for too long, fine, whatever. You can stay in the supply room. I don't have time to argue about it right now. His residence was the least of her current worries. I get to keep my social media accounts too. Jody shook her head. You can't. It's dangerous. You don't understand, Sheriff. It's my life source. She frowned in confusion. What? I'm a fame demon. We thrive on attention. If you make me shut off my social media accounts, I will literally die. There's no other source of admiration and following for me, at least not my current form. Why don't you just possess a rock star or something? It was an idea that she'd hastily suggested before realizing perhaps she shouldn't be steering Bees that direction. Not that I'd condone such a thing. When I pissed off Luke, I really pissed him off. He trapped me in this form. I can't just shuffle it off for a mortal coil of my liking. This is who I am, and I'm stuck this way. I'm fighting for my survival, Sheriff Shaw. She darted a glance at Stanton, who was clearly trying to throw off weight. Veer freezing magic Bees was using. She was afraid he might succeed if he were determined enough. Fine. You can stay, and the social media accounts can continue. But you have to make sure it's coming across as a joke. We can't afford to have people believe you. That's always been my approach, and you would know it if you'd bothered to look at them. He sounded highly offended, but he turned his gaze toward Stanton as the man tried to lurch upward. Bees touched his forehead, emitting a bright red light that caused Stanton's heels to drum on the floor, and when Bees stepped back, he was completely still. Jody frowned. Did you kill him? She wasn't worried about Stanton, who was already dead and probably not able to be killed again. Her fear was far more for Mr. Walton, whose form might still survive all this if he wasn't too injured. Of course not. He smoothed his front, as though he were wearing fine clothing that needed to have a wrinkle removed, and adjusted his belt. I know how to do magic, Sheriff Shaw. He lumbered over to her, lifting up his arm, which was grotesquely long compared to the rest of his frame. Do we have a deal? He eyed her with a hint of suspicion. She forced herself to take his hand, finding his skin felt just like hers. It wasn't chapped, rough, or leathery as she'd expected. It was weird to feel his nails digging into the back of her hand as she shook his, and she realized he only had 3 fingers on each hand as she discreetly disengaged as quickly as she could. Then she moved past him and reached for the handcuffs hanging from her duty belt. He watched her slap them on Stanton before asking, why don't you just do a binding spell? Jody's fingers fumbled with the second latch, and it took her a moment to lock the cuffs into place. This is just as easy. Bees looked confused. It really isn't. You could do a binding spell from several feet away. Why would you get close to the suspect like that if you don't have to? It's the way I've always done things. He was leaving her feeling defensive, and there was a bite of anger in her tone. Bees suddenly laughed. I bet you haven't been studying. Do you even know how to do a binding spell? She ignored his comments as she stepped back, eyeing her gun on the counter. She walked over to retrieve it and held it at her side instead of returning it to her duty belt, just in case Stanton woke. She wasn't certain what kind of control he had over the vessel as a demon, and if the cuffs didn't hold him, she'd want the Smith & Wesson. The question was, would a bullet even work on Stanton, or would it just kill Mr. Walton? With a sigh, she acknowledged she was going to have to spend some time studying the book. The front door opened then, and she looked up to see Drake walking down the hall toward them. He was moving at a rapid clip, and his eyes took on a red glow when he saw the scene before him. He stepped over Stanton without looking down at him. Instead, he came to stand in front of Jody, and she was surprised at the gentle way he handled her head as he turned it to look at the injury. You're bleeding. He sounded angry. Am I? In the adrenaline of it all, she hadn't even noticed. Hesitantly, she lifted her hand to touch the spot he was also touching, and it came away smeared with blood, but it seemed to be a slow trickle. I think I'm fine. We'll have the EMTs check you out to be safe. She started to tell him that wasn't necessary, but he gave her a firm look. Don't mess around with a head injury, Sheriff. With a sigh, she nodded and then instantly regretted the motion. Yeah, okay. But first, can you deal with Stanton? He nodded as he moved over to stand beside Stanton, who was just starting to stir. What's with the handcuffs? I had to keep him confined. If you'd been a little faster, I wouldn't have needed them. He frowned up at her. I told you I was pretty far away. It's not like I can just teleport myself from one place to the next. It seems like the sort of thing a demon should be able to do though, doesn't it? She asked overly sweetly. He muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, I'm only half demon, but he didn't look up at her again. Instead, he rolled Stanton onto his back and reached into his pocket. He removed a pendant with some complicated sigil forged from what looked like iron. He pressed it against Mr. Walton's forehead, causing Stanton to jerk fully awake and start to curse as the skin around where the sigil touched began to smoke. An unholy cry came from him, and it was certainly not human. He started pleading and bargaining for Drake to stop, and then he was simply flat out begging. With a flash of red, it was over as quickly as it had begun. Jody stepped closer as Drake's fingers moved to Mr. Walton's neck. Is it over? He nodded. He's back in hell already. Drake chuckled. I'm sure he's about to receive a really warm welcome. Jody wasn't quite able to see the humor just yet. She was just relieved he was gone, and she breathed a deep sigh of relief when Mr. Walton started to move. How am I going to explain this to him? He'll probably remember bits and pieces, enough to know he doesn't want to ask too many questions or remember very much of it. I imagine he'll understand what happened, but if not, we'll explain it to him. He looked at the phone on the desk. Why don't you call emergency services? You still need to be checked out, and it's probably a good idea to have them look at Mr. Walton as well. Jody went to the phone, and using her badge number, she was able to get the promise of the ambulance at the station within 10 minutes. The EMTs arrived in less than 5, but Jody wasn't certain if they knew everything that had happened, or about the supernatural side of the town. She noted Bees had made himself scarce, so that suggested perhaps they didn't, or maybe they just didn't know about him. That made her careful with what she said, and Mr. Walton was mostly speechless. He was still obviously recovering his wits, but when one of the EMTs asked what happened, he said, I don't know. Jody quickly invented an excuse for him being there before adding he had fainted unexpectedly. Both EMTs seemed skeptical, but they looked him over and declared him well enough to go home. As he started to leave, Drake said, Wait a minute. The sheriff has a head injury. She glared at Drake for tattling on her, but she submitted to an exam. When the EMT held up his fingers, Jody realized she was seeing double. He frowned. I think you're okay, but you should definitely get some rest and don't do anything too taxing. Have someone check on you every few hours, okay? Every hour on the hour? Asked Drake. The EMT shook his head. Nah, we discovered that's not really necessary. Waking her once or twice throughout the night should be sufficient, Mr. Abaddon. He nodded to both of them and to his partner. I think we're done here. The other man gathered his gear, and they were soon out of the station. Mr. Walton still looked dazed, but he was making his way toward the exit as well. Jody patted him on his shoulder as he passed. Can you make it home okay, Mr. Walton? He hesitated for a moment but nodded. I think I'll be fine, Sheriff. Thank you. He sent a look at Drake as well. Thank you both, and that little red man who helped as well. He shook his head again, though it was difficult to tell if he was trying to dispel the memory of what had happened, or he was still feeling dazed. Muttering something to himself, he shuffled out of the sheriff's station, leaving her with just Drake. Bees was lurking somewhere nearby, so they weren't truly alone, but for a moment, it felt like they were. Jody was surprised by how much she liked the idea. I need to get home to tell my mother and grandmother I'm okay. He frowned. But you're seeing double. I don't think you should drive. No, I probably shouldn't. It's not a very long walk. I'll drive you. She thought about refusing, but it would be churlish to do so, especially since she wasn't entirely confident of walking several blocks to her house in her current state. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Abaddon. Don't you think you can call me Drake now? After all, I did save your life. She laughed. I think Bees gets the credit for that, but I could have handled it. You just arrived and played around with your necklace, Drake. It's a little more than a necklace. It's ancient Enochian magic, which you would know all about if you'd been studying your book. There was a hint of reproof in his tone as he steered her out of the sheriff's station. He wasn't exactly touching her, but his hand hovered near her elbow in case she started to stumble. He guided her toward her SUV, and she froze at the sight of a motorcycle parked beside it. There's no way I'm riding on that in my current condition. He nudged her forward and past the motorcycle. I wasn't inviting you to ride on Evita. I'll drive you home in the sheriff's rig, and then I'll walk back to retrieve my motorcycle. Her head was spinning slightly, and she appreciated his hands on her hips as he helped steady her while she got into the passenger side. Oddly enough, she felt bereft when he was no longer touching her, but then she closed her eyes as a wave of nausea swept over her. You named your motorcycle? She waited to ask that until he had walked around and joined her in the cab behind the wheel. Of course. My motorcycle is Evita, my gun is Nora, and my machete is Bianca. She frowned. Odd names. Why are they all named after women? She groaned then. They're your exes, aren't they? He chuckled. Could be. Evita was a crazy ride, but the destination was outright crazy. She suspected he might be inventing all this just to amuse her, but she was too drained to level the allegation. And Nora? She was quick to fire up and had lethal aim, at least with her sharp tongue. You think that would have been the name you gave your knife then? He sounded wounded. First of all, Bianca is not just a knife. She's a machete. And secondly, Bianca could take a man's head off with a sharp glare and a sharper word. It's a perfect name for a knife. I'm not sure I believe a word of that, Drake. That's your prerogative, Jody. He stopped the vehicle then. We're here. She opened her eyes, realizing she'd lost track of the last few minutes, aside from their silly conversation. It seemed like he'd gotten her home rather quickly, even though it was only a short distance. She was still fumbling to open the door when he came around to assist her, helping her out. She thought maybe he held her against him for a second longer than necessary, but she wasn't complaining as she leaned closer. She told herself it was just for support, because her head was spinning, but there was probably more to it than that. She was in no mood to suss it out, so she accepted his arm as he helped her walk up the sidewalk to her front door. Her mother was waiting, and Isabel crowded out behind her. What happened? Graham sounded frantic. The demon's gone, said Jody cheerfully. I arrested him, and our bounty hunter here has sent him back to hell. She giggled. He was trying to settle down and have a happy ever after with you, Mom. That struck her as oddly hilarious, and she started to laugh in earnest. She has a slight concussion, said Drake with almost a hint of apology in his tone. She might be kind of goofy like this for a while. I'm not go. OFY. Even as she said it, Jody giggled again. She couldn't identify what was particularly happy or funny this time, but she felt giddy and strange. Would you mind helping her to her room, young man? Asked Isabel. Of course not. Jody let out a squeal of protest when the world revolved around her again, but she realized it was just because Drake had lifted her into his arms and was now carrying her into her house. This really isn't necessary. I don't need your help, Drake. I'm a grown woman. You certainly are, but there's no shame in needing a little help sometimes. As he spoke, her world shifted again, and she realized he was laying her on her bed. She felt the oddest slight sensation, like his lips brushed against her forehead before he pulled away, and she was lying alone. She opened her eyes, looking up at the two Drakes in front of her. Thank you for your help tonight. I could have handled it on my own, of course. Of course, he said with a hint of gentle mocking. He stretched out of her view for a minute before returning, holding up the book she was supposed to be studying. Spend some time getting familiar with this, Sheriff. You never know when you'll actually need the magic you're supposed to learn. Yes, sir, she said in a tone full of mock compliance. His lips twitched. If only it were that easy to get you to mind. Take care of yourself, Jody. With those words, he turned and exited her room. Jody allowed herself to sleep a few minutes later, though Drake accompanied her into her dreams. They were disjointed and not particularly memorable, but she still woke the next morning feeling refreshed and wearing a smile. Chapter 14. Jody. When she left her room for breakfast, her stomach growled in response to the delicious scents wafting from the kitchen. She found her mother and grandmother already waiting for her at the table, though they hadn't started eating yet. They must have heard her stirring. She took a seat between them, aware of their concerned looks. I'm fine, she said preemptively. I have a little bit of a headache, but I really feel okay. That was true. There was a tender spot in her head, and her headache was definitely there, but it was manageable. I'll even take the day off to satisfy you both. She was certain that was coming, so she might as well address the request head-on. It's about time you had some sense, girl, said Isabel decisively. What were you thinking, facing off with a demon alone? I didn't know he was there in the station. I guess he must have slipped in while I was walking Mom to her car. And I suppose that monster followed me to the station to find out why I was canceling our date. He said he wanted a happy ever after with me? Was that just the concussion talking, Jody? Her mother looked pale at the thought. Reluctantly, Jody shook her head. No, he thought he'd reformed himself, and apparently, having the ideal woman was a big part of that. Lucky for you, he decided you were the traditional Mary homemaker, and you'd make his life simply perfect. Willa looked vaguely ill as she stirred cream into her coffee. The nerve of the man. Jody could have reminded her mom that Stanton had done far worse things in his life and afterlife, but she didn't want to upset her mom again. She imagined Willa would be happy to forget all about Stanton's existence, and Jody couldn't pretend she wouldn't be equally pleased to do the same. Who was that handsome young man who brought you home last night? Isabel buttered toast and set a piece on Jody's plate as she asked. I can feed myself, Graham. I didn't say you couldn't. Isabel still added a serving of bacon and eggs as she spoke. So, who is he? He's one of hell's bounty hunters, and his father's a demon. Willa gasped. And he was in our house. Well, it doesn't mean he's a demon, said Jody, feeling a strange need to defend him. He said he was just sort of dragged into the family business. I don't know all the details, but I don't think he's a bad person. I bet he's a demon in the sack, said Isabel with a speculative gleam in her eyes followed by a huge grin. Willa gasped. Mother, must you always think about that? Don't think I didn't find that strip of condoms you put behind my wallet. I was so embarrassed when I pulled it out to pay for my part of dinner. I've never been that humiliated in my life. Jody giggled as she could easily visualize her mother's expression when she'd reached into her purse and unexpectedly pulled out a row of condoms as well. She did her best to hide her laughter in the cup of coffee she scooped up, but she could see from her mother's repressive glare and Isabel's unrepentant grin that she wasn't successful in hiding her amusement. When she finally regained control, she put down the coffee cup again and said, I have no intention of finding out how Mr. Abaddon is in any form, besides occasionally working with him. I gather it isn't an infrequent occurrence for souls to escape hell, so I probably have to deal with him from time to time, but that's all there is to it. Sure, it is, said her grandmother with a knowing wink. You just keep telling yourself that, Jody. I think it's sensible of you to steer clear of any sort of involvement with a bounty hunter who works for hell and has demon parentage. Willa nodded her head decisively. You're always so close-minded, dear. Isabel sounded disappointed in her daughter. It's hardly close-minded to want my daughter not to date a demon. Jody smiled as their light bickering washed over her, deciding she'd leave the two of them to settle it. She'd spoken about the matter, and she hadn't said anything that wasn't true. She had no intention of getting more deeply involved with Drake or anyone else in this town, and she'd never had any difficulty steering clear of relationships in the past. She couldn't see that changing just because Harrow Bay was so unique. After finishing breakfast, she pushed away from the table and excused herself to return to her room. Jody curled up on the bed and opened the book she was supposed to be memorizing, but it was dry reading and failed to hold her attention. Instead, she found her thoughts turning to the town, mulling over what had happened already, and speculating about what the future held. She was certain she was doing the right thing by staying in Harrow Bay, but she was equal parts apprehensive and excited when she contemplated just what might come next to their supernatural hamlet. Look for the entire Harrow Bay series in ebook. The free audiobooks will continue to be published on the YouTube channel as well in the coming weeks.